You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, this is Marc Lamont Hill. I am a journalist and an academic and a YouTuber on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. And I'm excited to talk to you, man. I've heard a lot about you.
Uh-oh. Well, I don't know what your positions are on anything. I know sometimes people tag me with big accounts and they're like, hey, debate Israel Palestine. And I've been doing a lot of reading for this particular area. So, yeah, I've just been talking to a lot of people, generally pro-Palestinian people, sometimes the really pro-Zionist people. But, yeah, do you have a particular spot you wanted to start at, or...
No, I mean, it's funny. People have said the same thing to me about you. Like, you two should debate. And I don't know what we would debate, but I think for me, I guess the most interesting place to start is the moment we're in right now, given all of the death and violence and destruction, and kind of making sense of it. Maybe then it'll cause us to take a step back and figure out all the causes and the solutions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I can get my perspective, and then, yeah, we can go from there if you want.
Sure, that works for me.
Yeah, I think right now, I think Israel is in a war with the Gaza Strip. I think Hamas is the stated enemy. I think Israel's goal is to eliminate Hamas. I think they have the moral authority to do so. I think it's totally acceptable that they go to war with this. I think that, unfortunately, there is a high cost right now of civilian casualties. I'm not sure there's any way to avoid that at the moment. I don't think a ceasefire where Hamas remains in power is acceptable. Yeah, I think broadly, that's kind of my takes on the current conflict right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I don't begin from the same place. For starters, I don't begin from the place of saying Israel is ever in a position of moral authority. I don't think that's the case. But more fundamentally, or probably more relevant, certainly more urgently, I don't believe the claim that they are actually fighting Hamas, that they're at war with Hamas. I think the thing that I've been consistently saying is that they are actually, it's a war on the Palestinian people. It's a war on Gaza. And Hamas becomes an effective, a compelling, maybe even a persuasive pretext for a set of actions that they've always wanted to do and that they've always sort of done. And finally, Hamas, I think, gave them ample reason and excuse to do so.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess we can dive into that. I feel like this idea that they're at war with the Palestinian people, what do we mean by that, I guess, more specifically?
That they're a few things. One, when you look at sort of the statements that have been made, which we could take or leave as they argued in the ICJ, some of that is just anger and emotion and all that stuff. But there have been numerous Israeli statesmen, numerous Israeli former military figures, people in the Knesset, people who range from the middle to the right wing, who have sort of said, hey, we're going to have another Nakba here. People who have said, we're going to bomb them 3 generations back. We're going to turn Gaza into tents. That kind of language isn't suggestive of a surgical, targeting of Hamas, or even a reasonably efficient war on Hamas that will inevitably bring civilian casualties, because all wars bring some casualties. That's unavoidable. But it seems to me that they quite clearly know that the tactics that they're deploying are going to lead to a high number of civilian casualties and a relatively low, comparatively, number of Hamas operatives who are killed.
For these two things, if Israel was indeed trying to maximize casualties for Palestinians, why would they give so much warning to try to evac people from, say, northern Gaza before beginning operations there? Why not just start bombing?
So there's 2 answers to that. I think one, I don't buy that. I don't accept their public narrative that they're always so committed to warning people, and I think there's plenty of counter evidence to that. But then there are also moments where they very explicitly said, we're not going to do that. I'll give you an example. Roof knocking has been an Israeli tactic for years, right? Where they drop a non-explosive munition, to let people know you got an hour to get out, you got a half hour to get out, you got 10, whatever the time frame is to get out. And they very explicitly said, and I've even interviewed Israeli leaders who have said, hey, roof knocking stopped on October 7th. And there's been a kind of a consistent narrative of, because of what they did to us, we no longer have the same rules of engagement. But then when you look at what people are actually saying on the ground, whether it's in Rafah right now, or if you look 2 or 3 weeks ago when journalists were killed, for example, or other civilians, where they were told that they were on a path that was for journalists, or a path that was a humanitarian corridor or a safe path, they still got hit. There were people, countless reports of people from the north who traveled south and were still hit on the road where they told was safe. So both in word at times, but certainly in practice consistently, it's been pretty hard to make a case that that Israel's been committed to protecting the vulnerable here.
So a couple things. So when you say you don't accept the public narrative that they're always committed to warning people, I mean, Israel pretty unequivocally goes above and beyond when it comes to warning people, more so than I think than has been observed in any other active military theater, whether it's making phone calls to people, contacting community leaders, putting out notice 24, 48, 72 hours in advance for people to leave. I think Israel has gone above and beyond, say, what any international law requirement would be to warn civilian population to leave northern Gaza. I don't think that's controversial. We can go into examples or arguments relating to that.
I would disagree with that.
Okay. I mean, they do, and I don't think anybody else takes that same level of precaution that they do. We can argue that they might have some higher level of precaution they should take because it's so densely populated, but Israel does try really hard to warn people to get them to actually leave. Now, for whatever reason, Hamas has told some of them that they're not allowed to leave or that they can't leave. Hamas did prevent some people from fleeing south. When you said that roof knocking has been a tactic that Israel's used for years, roof knocking, again, that's not something that's required by international law to do that level of warning. They would sometimes, although as the threat increases, the notice that you give the enemy for where you're going to attack probably decreases. So roof knocking, for instance, wouldn't be something you would do if you think it's going to give the enemy combatant time to hide. That's only something you're going to do if you're trying to destroy infrastructure and you don't care if enemy combatants are leaving. And then people traveling from the north to the south so got hit. Yeah, there's no guarantee that the south is going to be completely free of attacks, just that the north would be far more heavily bombed than the south. So if you move south, the chances of you getting attacked are going to be far lesser than if you remain in the north, basically.
Couple points. So you said that Israel goes above and beyond. I want to be clear there. So when you say above and beyond, the question becomes above and beyond what? And you've raised two different comparators there. One is what other countries do, and the second is international law. I would push back. In fact, I would fully disagree with the idea that notifying civilians is not part and parcel of, or is not directly what international law demands. In other words, they're not going to warn civilian population. You have a duty. Let me make it even more clear. You have a duty as a nation to use all available means to prevent civilian deaths. And if you don't, then you're actually in violation of international law. So telling people, hey, we're going to bomb here in 10 minutes, or we're going to bomb here in an hour, is absolutely what you're supposed to do. That's not a bonus, or that's not above and beyond by any stretch. I would agree that other nations have committed war crimes, that other nations have also not followed this. But you raised an important counterpoint to yourself, which I think you're right about, which is when it's such a densely populated area and people have so few options. You're talking about 5 miles wide, 25 miles, long. People have limited options to evacuate. You're right. There's no guarantee that if you leave one place that you're going to be completely safe. But that wasn't my argument. My argument was they're bombing the very places they told them would be safe shelters. There are people in camps. There are people in hospitals. There are people in other places where they were told, if you go to this place, this will not happen. And they're saying, contrary to what they were told, those very places were bombed prior to the time where they said bombing would begin, or prior to the time where they said that some kind of act of violence would begin. I guess my question, I would go back to the beginning of that and just pose it as a question to you. what is your understanding of what international law requires people to do?
So a couple things. So international law absolutely does not require you to take every single precaution to avoid civilian deaths. That would basically eliminate a country's ability to go to war. None of the Geneva Conventions mandate that you have to take every single precaution. They'll say reasonable precautions. I think it's Article 57.
Yes, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah, reasonable precautions. But even in Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1 to the 49 Geneva Conventions, it literally says, like, I think the quote is, effective advanced warning of attacks which may affect the civilian population unless circumstances do not permit. And there's a whole calculation of proportionality that goes into conducting attacks. And unfortunately, civilian deaths are oftentimes included because that's war. It sucks, and it does. Now, curiously, it is also a part of international law that you have a duty to protect your civilian population when conducting war, which Hamas absolutely does not follow, unequivocally so.
What do you mean?
As in, Hamas doesn't take any precautions to protect their civilian population. They conduct strikes from civilian populations, they operate among civilian populations, they store ammunition and weapons among civilian populations, and they operate out of civilian hospitals. That's a violation of international customary law, at least. Yeah.
So a couple things there. If you're saying Hamas, I would not disagree with you that Hamas does not always take precautions.
They don't take any precautions ever. They don't.
What's the basis of that claim that they take no precautions?
The basis of the claim is, I can try to find those particular articles, but I know Michael Schmidt does a lot of foreign policy analysis, and in parts of the articles that he's written, it's been observed that Hamas has prevented people from fleeing south into southern Gaza as Israel is putting out the warnings. In Amnesty International reports, they've reported that Hamas at times will store, I know for 2014, for instance, I know that it was in this one, that they put out evidence that Hamas would be firing rockets from neighborhoods or from outside schoolyards, or they'd be storing ammunition in civilian buildings. These are all things that somebody's doing that's not taking proper care and precaution to protect their civilian population, because you're turning civilian targets into military targets. Oh, another good example is all those videos that we saw of I think it was the Al Shifa hospital being used as a base of operations for terrorists to take back hostages or prisoners of war and to operate out of that hospital. Amnesty International also documented them using that same hospital, I think in 2007, 2008, maybe in 2014 again, as like an interrogation center too. Once you do these things, these places lose their civilian protection status. They become military targets under international law. So
there's like four things there that I strongly disagree with.
Sure.
The first thing is just at the level of argumentation. I stipulated at the beginning that I think sometimes Hamas doesn't take sufficient precaution. Your arguments prove the point that I was already making, which is sure, they don't always take sufficient precaution. That's a critique I would have of Hamas.
You agree that that's a violation of at least international customary law?
What I was disagreeing with is that they don't take any precaution, and there's just no basis for that, right? To say they don't take any, and the reason, and I'm not trying to quibble or be pedantic here. I'm saying that there's plenty of evidence of Hamas doing the opposite. It's just if you point to the examples where they do, you can say, well, sure.
Oh, okay. Right? Okay. Could you give me some? I'm curious. Yeah,
I will. But let me circle back for one moment. Well, actually, let me answer so you don't think I'm avoiding it.
Sure.
There's a reasonable expectation again that if people are in a hospital, they're in El Shifa, they're in El Ahli, they're in these places, that they won't be struck. And the fact that there is a Hamas soldier in there or a Hamas affiliated person in this structure doesn't mean that you lose the protected status. It's a pretty high bar you have to meet to lose the protected status, and the burden of proof is on the established nation. So my point is the fact that civilians are encouraged to go to these locations is actually a sign that they won't be struck, is a desire not to be struck. Now one could make the case that they're deliberately telling civilians to go there because they won't be struck. Right, and that's a military tactic rather than, say, a philanthropic one or a generous one. We could debate that one way or the other, but nevertheless, the decision to have them go to those spaces is specifically because there was an expectation based on international law and convention that they wouldn't be struck. You mentioned El Shifa Hospital, though. When you look at the evidence of El Shifa Hospital, when you actually look at what was presented, the case that they made, not the drawings, not the cartoons, not the animations, but the actual evidence that they showed from El Shifa Hospital, there was not sufficient evidence. I saw little evidence to demonstrate that El Shifa Hospital was a command center. Could there have been a Hamas soldier underground? Of course there could have been. I'm sure there was, right? But again, you're in the most densely populated place in the world. There are going to be Hamas. There's literally no place from which Hamas could operate that would not have some civilians nearby. And that becomes part of Israel's argument, which again has been unsubstantiated by the international community, by human rights organizations, by the legal community, by the diplomatic community. There's been no persuasive case made that Hamas is fundamentally using human shields. It's a consistently made argument by Israel, but it hasn't actually been made. And if you look at Al Shifa Hospital, when you look at, for example, the photos they revealed, where you saw some handcuffs, a little bit of weapons, a box of dates, there's all this stuff, but there was no evidence that it was a command center. And the idea that because Hamas is there, we can bomb it is absolutely not true. I agree with you. Hospitals can lose protected status. They absolutely can. But none of the hospitals, even like in the last 48 hours, we've seen several hospitals struck. There have been shootings inside of Al Amal Hospital and inside of another one in I believe, Khan Yunis. That certainly, there's been no case that they've lost their protected status, and yet people have still been shot inside them, or at least Israeli soldiers have shot inside of them. I don't know. The last report I saw was not necessarily that someone was killed, but they're shooting inside of them, which is a violation of international law. And so this idea that Israel has obeyed international law or been committed to it outside of their own statements is a bit puzzling to me. And the reason why I don't take any nation state on their face. It's not particular to Israel, but Israel has consistently in Protective Edge, in Cast Lead previously. If you just look at the last 3 so-called wars, they have consistently made claims that have never been proven and have often been proven to be not true later on.
So I find that there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to international law, and I feel like that's where most of these claims come from. So Hamas undeniably uses human shields. I know that Finkelstein puts forth this idea that a human shield is when you commandeer or you basically forcefully conscript a civilian to pick up a weapon and fight. Under international law, human shielding just means you're co-locating military objects with civilian objects. For us, for international customary law, it'd be Rule 97 on the ICRH website, or the ILH, the International Red Cross Customary Law Database. I think it's Rule 97. Yeah. It's called human shields. Yeah. So co-location of military and civilian objects is human shields. Now you can say that it's hard not to use human shields in these areas. That's fine. I mean, there's stronger evidence of sometimes civilians in Gaza will move towards particular Israeli sites that they say they're going to strike. You've also got the fact that Hamas themselves said that they're going to use those hostages or put them in tunnels. So if Israel tries to attack the tunnels, that would be an example of human shielding. Also taking hostages is also a contravention of international law. So the other side is already breaking tons of international law. On the Israeli side, again, I have to reiterate, and it sucks, and I know that it sucks, but civilians die in war. Typically, your international laws are going to prevent a party from either acting with wanton recklessness or specifically targeting civilians for the sake of killing civilians. Killing civilians in and of itself is not a war crime. Killing civilians, even a lot of civilians, to kill a few combatants is also not a war crime. Targeting hospitals that are housing enemy combatants is also not a war crime. Any protection that you might have as a civilian building or a hospital instantly ceases to exist once military objects are being co-located within that location. And
I'm saying that's not true. That's simply not true. So there are a few things that are.
Wait. Yeah, which part of that was not true? We can be very precise.
The co-location of a military object does not ipso facto disqualify a site as a military site. By that argument, if a single Hamas soldier were to walk into a children's hospital in Gaza, you're saying that we could then bomb the hospital?
No, wait. I didn't say you could bomb the hospital. So the hospital loses. So ordinarily in times of war, you're never supposed to attack a hospital as long as it's a civilian object. Now, once a single military combatant has started to use that hospital, now you're required to engage it as a military target, but you still have to keep in mind the rules of proportionality. Meaning if one soldier goes in there and there's 100,000 dying leukemia children cancer patients, probably you can't destroy that building because...
No, but that's the point. That's the point I'm getting at, right? Because a moment ago you said, well, killing an individual's... killing a bunch of civilians in order to get one combatant is not a war crime as such, right? That was
correct.
And so in the example that you're giving right now, where that's why I picked up that example and said, okay, so now you have a single Hamas soldier inside of a hospital. I'm saying, first of all, I'm disputing the premise that simply by virtue of that Hamas soldier walking into a hospital no longer has protected status. That is absolutely not
Well, when you say walk into a hospital, what do you mean when you say this? Like, is he taking there as a sick person, or is he walking there as a civilian, or is he going there as an active combatant? Well, because if he goes in as an active combatant, it is now a military target. Yes.
But how do you? So two things. If he walks in as a patient, you absolutely can't shoot him.
Correct, because it's what is it? Horrors Day Combat, I think, is for people that are no longer like active threats. That would include even a ton of military people that are no longer active threats.
Which we saw just 10 days ago, or about 10 days ago. There was someone in a hospital bed who was killed.
Yeah, right? but that's a little bit different. Horrors Day Combat, I think, implies that you no longer have the ability to participate in military activity. The people that were killed in the hospital were military commanders. They can still operate from a hospital bed.
One person wasn't conscious.
He might not have been, but I think the other two were. Yeah.
So let's concede that the other two were. How is killing the one who's unconscious not a war crime?
I would have to dig into the specifics of that. I feel like I read something. There's a difference between somebody being under treatment versus just being unconscious. Like if they were unconscious and they woke up and then they were undergoing treatment, then you would say that this person is no longer a military. Like the Horrors Day Combat has been met. But if a person's just unconscious and you're like retreating, for instance, you can kill an unconscious soldier. If somebody's unconscious and brought to a hospital, and the assumption is as soon as they wake up, they're going to resume military operations. That person is still a fair target until they're up and then just like in bed receiving treatment and removed from combat operations.
There have been conflicting reports about the person's health, so I won't hang my hat on their specific health condition.
Keep in mind, let me just say this, because for a lot of people, it feels wrong and it feels bad. All four Geneva Conventions, which is where a lot of these rules come from, all four of these Geneva Conventions required a sign-off from every single country in the world. So when you envision, I'm not saying you necessarily, but everybody listening, when you're envisioning international law, what you have to think is, what will countries sign on to that still allows them to conduct warfare while acknowledging that we all need some kind of playbook so that we're not like constantly all like genociding each other or just murdering civilians, with reckless intent, right?
Right.
So being able to conduct war, right? If an enemy commander on the field is knocked unconscious, and then an army is like retreating, the idea that like, well, you can't shoot them, they're retreating, that's not true. You want to be able to rout and destroy an army that's retreating if they haven't explicitly surrendered. Just because a commander is like in bed or, he's knocked out and he's going to wake up and start commanding immediately, you don't want to lose the ability to attack enemy commanders unless he's officially completely removed from command, like decommissioned or whatever. Like, countries still need to be able to conduct war. It sucks sometimes. Like, there are going to be military targets that are going to have civilians killed, but that's part and parcel of war, which sucks. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a oddly generous reading of international law that seems to be in contradiction with all the spirit and sort of convention of these laws. To be specific, retreating soldiers, people waving a white flag, people in hospitals, people unconscious.
Different things there. So if a soldier is able to surrender to you,
I'm deliberately naming. I'm not piling these all together. I'm saying these are all.
Because I'm going to say retreating soldiers are fair game. White flag soldiers shouldn't be fair game. So like when Israel shot the three guys coming out where they were waving the white flags, that my understanding is that's not fair game. But yeah,
no, that would absolutely not be fair game. I was naming four things that I think are all examples, and I was going to unpack each one of them. I understand you think that one of these things is not like the other. I get you.
Okay.
I'm saying I lump those all together, and I think international law does too. But if we just focus on, and I don't want to get too hemmed up on this hospital bed thing, but I think it's a perfect example. As is, and you'll probably also disagree again, but I think also coming in dressed as a doctor is also a violation of international law, right? Which and this isn't this just for those that are watching this. This isn't just a hypothetical. This is literally what happened, right? They come into the hospital dressed as medical personnel, right? People are in the hospital presumably to get treatment, and they're killed, right? Both the pretending to be medical staff as well as the actual killing. I'm saying both are examples of war crimes. But just to take it a step back for a moment, just so we don't get, and we feel free to respond to that. But as we just to take a step back again, my point is the targeting of the hospital itself as a site of violence, as a site of shelling, as a site of bombing, etc. I'm saying is a war crime, not just because there are casualties, because casualties are going to happen. I think we agree on that. But Israel has the military capacity not to do that.
Not to have any civilian casualties?
No. Not to do indiscriminate bombing. Israel's getting, whether it's carpet bombing, whether it's hitting a whole. The idea that there's these two. We have intelligence that there are two Hamas commanders inside of this hospital. We don't want them to get away. The hospital is no longer a safe zone based on the International Red Cross standard, and so therefore we can attack the hospital. Even if I concede at that point, the type of bombing and the scale of the bombing is inconsistent with the spirit of preventing civilian death. So to
be clear, all Israel has to do is give adequate forewarning. That's the only obligation they have under international law, is to give adequate forewarning, and then to do a proportionality calculation when it comes to
adequate. What would adequate warning be in a hospital where people are unconscious, or like at a shifa where there are premature babies, in a hospital where there are elderly people, and in a machine where there are people who are tied to machines? What would adequate warning be?
I mean, that's going to vary from situation to situation, but
I'm saying in this specific situation.
In this specific situation, has Israel like full on bombed a hospital? I don't think they have. What?
El Shifa.
Oh, that's the one from like 3 months ago, right?
Yeah.
Let me make a note of that. Besides Al Shifa, have they bombed any hospitals?
I mean, I would say yes, but again, if our premise is that they haven't committed any international laws, it's not. You don't get a free one, right?
Well, so the precautions and attacks are important. This comes under Article 57 of the additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. Taking precautions are important, but like they don't spell out exactly what has to happen, right? Like the wordage or the verbiage here is like, do everything feasible to verify that the objectives to be attacked are neither civilians nor civilian objects that are not subject to special protections, but are military objectives within the meaning of paragraph 2 of Article 52, and that it's not prohibited by the revisions to the protocol to attack them. So they have to make sure that it's a military target, meaning there's some military personnel there. And then it says you have to take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding and in any event to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. All you have to do is like your best. That's really all it says.
Right. I mean, again, I think
I'm just saying that like nothing. There's nothing that explicitly calls out what you have to do, and Israel goes above and beyond. There is no other fighting force in the world.
What do you mean? What
I'm about to say. No other fighting force in the world does what Israel does when it comes to warning people about imminent attacks. Nobody else in the world does that.
Okay.
Like, if you want, you can name one, but nobody else in the world goes to that level to like make phone calls to buildings telling them that like, hey, Israel literally has phone teams to call people. Yeah, go ahead.
I disagree with that claim, but my point is the standard in international law is not to compare it to all other people. If I said if all other nations were war criminals, right? You know, and let's say you and let me make it concrete. If you and I agree that 5 hours is enough time to tell people, right? And we found out that every other nation in the world gives you 2 hours. We say, okay, they're all war criminals. And then if Israel does 2.5 hours, they'd still be war criminals, even if they go above and beyond every other nation. So I'm saying it's actually not proper to point to other nations as the comparator, right? Well,
no, but I mean, like as a matter of international customary law, I mean, we kind of do. We look at like how does everybody act? What do we all agree on the rules? And if nobody else is taking the level of precautions that Israel is, it's hard to say that like Israel isn't taking enough precautions, right?
Unless we agree that no nation takes enough precautions, right?
International customary law basically works by looking collectively at what we all agree to do. So if nobody takes precautions, then international customary law would say that, like, well, I guess we probably don't have to take that many precautions. Nobody seems to be doing it. You wouldn't hold one nation to an exemplary standard, saying.
And I don't think we should. And I don't think we should hold one nation to an exemplary standard. Yeah,
sure. But I'm just saying that, like, do we agree? Does any other nation give the amount of warning that Israel does when it comes to attacking civilian areas? Does any like who?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at and also I would say most nations don't attack civilian areas with the same consistency that Israel does. Now, part of that again is.
Well, wait. I'm curious. Who takes that level of precaution?
You know, if you look, for example, at and I'm not defending the United States at all,
sure.
Right?
Don't
but the United States. But it's I hate defending the United States, but absolutely the United States takes precaution before
we take precaution, but not at we weren't making phone calls to houses. We dropped a ton of leaflets. Was this for Mosul or Fallujah? We dropped a ton. No, it's not. Sartor, I want to say was the there's one of these good one, but like we'll drop leaflets. What?
Yeah. I think you mean Southern, yeah.
Yeah, it might have been, yeah. We'll drop a bunch of leaflets, but I'm pretty sure. Oh yeah, the siege of Sadr City. I'm pretty sure after we dropped the leaflets for that, and we gave them, I don't know how many days was it to leave. After that, we were like, listen, if you're still in the city, you're fair game.
Right, but if you look at the first move in Gaza, it wasn't a couple of days. It was hours. That's my point.
No, it was. There was,
24 hours.
There was a false report that it was 24 hours. That was never stated by the Israeli military. Some people ran with that headline.
But people on the ground. Again, if you're saying that if Israel says it didn't happen, then we're going to be at an impasse. But people on the ground in northern Gaza talked about getting hit 24 hours later. That's the point I'm making.
It wasn't 24 hours for every single person to evacuate. There might have been some attacks that happened maybe before 24 hours, but again, none of that is a violation of international law. They have a right to strike back if they're at war with Hamas. They have that right to do it. When Israel is providing advance notice, it's to minimize civilian casualties, not to reduce them to zero. There might still be military targets in the south. They might conduct operations in the north before every civilian is evacuated. All they're required to do is give about as much notice as they feel is reasonable, and then from there, they're allowed to begin fighting. Like, that's how wars go. And again, I think to reiterate, nobody has given the level of preparation for civilian targets. Russia doesn't. Even the United States doesn't. Ukraine doesn't. Literally nobody gives this level of notice to targets and areas before they begin conducting warfare. Nobody on the planet. Nobody does.
Where we disagree is on two things. One, I disagree with the amount of notice that you're saying they're giving. And second, even when the notice is given, I'm saying those areas are struck. So in every instance where they were told there was a humanitarian corridor in the south, they were struck. People's cars and buildings were struck going south when they were told to go from the north to the south.
There's nothing illegal about any of that. The idea is, listen, the most active areas are going to be in the north. You need to go south if you want to be somewhat safer, because Hamas doesn't protect the civilian populations. That's the warning Israel gives. That doesn't mean that...
You can't say they got notice. Then you can't say they got notice. If I say go down Main Street, I say, look, we're going to start bombing here. So everybody take Main Street and take Main Street until you get to the other part of town so that you can be safe. And then I start bombing Main Street. I can't then say, well, I gave you warning, but it's war. So, I can't promise you Main Street won't get bombed.
That's exactly what you could do. Yeah. If you say, listen, I'm going to bomb the north part of the city, go to the south part of the city if you want to be safer, and some people get bombed on the way to the south part of the city, that's part of the military operation. Now, the idea is the north part is going to...
You can't say you're getting notice. You can't say...
You only have to give notice with what's reasonable. It's literally written into the Geneva Conventions for whatever reason, unless other circumstances... under who deems that unreasonable? Again, I ask you, does anybody else give this level of notice? The answer is no. Nobody else does. So we're holding Israel to an impossible notice standard here that nobody else is required.
First of all, most nations when these types of bombings are happening are not asking large chunks, in this case, sometimes half of the entire population of the territory to move across the territory in 24 to 72 hours. Right? So we're not comparing apples to apples. If there are 2.5 million people in Gaza, or 2.2 million people in Gaza, and I'm telling 900,000 to 1.2 million to go from the north to the south, and I say you have 72 hours to leave before we start bombing. And then within hours, I'm bombing the very roads that I told them to take when they have no alternative. I mean, we're looking at it again right now in Rafah. We're looking at people who are being told, look, we're about to start a ground invasion. We're going to start a ground invasion, and so you need to leave. They're 20 kilometers south of where they need to be. They have no means of getting there. All the infrastructure is destroyed, and people are getting hit on the way out.
If people are fleeing south and Hamas combatants are operating within those groups of people fleeing, are they now not able to be targeted by the Israeli military?
So ask the question again.
Let's say that people are moving south and there are combatants that are moving among those people. Are those combatants now free from being targeted by the Israeli military?
So that's a good question, right? The short and simple answer would be, from a legal perspective, no. I don't disagree with that, right?
Okay, that's the whole point, right?
But there's a more complicated answer. I just didn't want to seem like I was avoiding what you're saying.
Yeah.
But the issue again becomes, particularly when you have all available means, right? Because again, you take all reasonable precautions. If I say, well, look, there's a Hamas combatant among these 100,000 people, what technology, what weaponry, what tactic am I deploying to get at those one or two Hamas operatives? Now, if we begin from the premise that hitting one or two Hamas operatives is so sufficiently important and urgent that we can engage in a military tactic or strike that we know will unavoidably cause 20 or not, I'll pick a more practical number, 300 people to die today, which consistently happens, then we have to ask ourselves, is that the only method? And is that target sufficiently worthy of that type of strike? And what we've seen consistently since October 7th is that any Hamas operative, any person who we deem to be an enemy combatant, is worth 100 to 150 Palestinian lives. And so when we see, for example, a bomb drop in a refugee camp, or we see a residential home struck, well, we know there's 8 people in there and maybe one is Hamas connected, maybe, right? Then we're taking a very high risk. And when we look at the fact that most of the people killed are women and children, 2/3 at this point.
Well, I don't, those numbers, well, children is a misnomer because it depends on what we mean by children. Are we talking about
under
17?
18?
Yeah, I don't think that's a valid use of the word children for this particular region.
Why?
Because 15, 16, 17-year-olds can be part of the military and can fight.
Right. Which becomes,
and when we say children, we're invoking the idea of like 4, 5, and 6-year-olds being killed. I think these are
I'm evoking the idea of people who are not legal adults. You know, if there were a high school shooting here in the United States, we would certainly say that children were killed. But I think sometimes, sadly, when we talk about the Middle East and the continent of Africa, we often adultify young people, and even in our framing of statistics, we say, well, you can be you're of enemy combatant age at say 14. And so,
yeah, hold on. Wait, no. Okay. When we say children, the reason why we use the word children is because we're evoking a few concepts. We're invoking usually somebody who doesn't have physically the means to fight, and we're usually invoking somebody that isn't participating in any reasonable capacity to fight. That usually when we say children, those are the two things that we mean. When you're talking about a 15, 16, 17-year-old that spent sometimes years training with weapons and is partaking in active military conflict and then gets killed in said conflict, to say that like, wow, they killed a child, that's really not fair. That's a really...
So when a 15-year-old Palestinian is killed, you're saying that's just an adult kill?
I didn't say that that's just an adult kill. I'm just saying just because they're 15 doesn't mean they were a child.
Okay. I'm saying... We can stipulate the new definitions of childhood, but I'm saying
we don't have no. It's not about stipulating new definitions. I'm just saying that child cosigns a lot of stuff. There's a lot of associated stuff. Generally, again, it's somebody that's usually helpless. It's somebody that's not taking part in an active military conflict. Usually, somebody who's there's like an assumption of innocence there. But when you've got a 15, 16, 17-year-old child soldier that's been fighting for years, what
percentage of guys and children under 18 are participating in military conflict?
I don't know the exact number of that.
I mean, do you have a rough estimate, or we just get? What I'm saying is, it sounds like we're just assuming that because
I know that we've seen literal videos of children. I know there was the one video that we literally saw of a child standing on top of a truck with a sling, slinging a rock at an Israeli soldier, then gets shot, and there's immediately a camera crew and a medical personnel standing right behind them. By the way, that would be a war crime. In order to basically cure him immediately while getting all of it on footage to show that children are being attacked by the IDF, which is like the propaganda lines that are... So
in the exact example you're giving, you're saying that wouldn't be... because that child slung a rock, you're saying that means they're a combatant and therefore a child wasn't killed based on the concepts that childhood invokes that you just raised? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, yeah. So, when we talk about school children being killed, right? Like... When you talk about Columbine, we don't usually refer to the shooters as like the children killed other children. You say the shooters or the mass murderers killed the children because it feels weird to say the children killed the children because child carries with it. Again, these assumptions of innocence and non-combatant, non-militant activity. Nobody would refer to a 15, 16, 17-year-old that's had weapons training for years, carrying an AK-47, raping and murdering civilians as a child. That's a really weird way to refer to that.
Well,
it's a way to
make made a whole leap with the raping and murdering civilians thing, but to the point of saying childhood, my issue with that.
If just right now, if we put our hands up, if we were to Google like women and children, you're not going to see a bunch of 17-year-old boys carrying M4s or AK-47s. You're going to see like little boys and their moms, or little boys and girls and their moms. That's what child usually means.
So by your definition, then, does that mean that if you're a woman soldier, you no longer invoke the sense of innocence and helplessness of the woman victim?
Yeah, I would say that too. That let's say you've got a fighting force, and we all believe this right now. Nobody looks at like Ukrainian or U.S. military deaths and go, "Wow, 30% of the soldiers killed in the United States were women." If 30% of our fighting forces were women, you say, "Well, they're soldiers." I mean, yeah. Why would we even think that? Of course not. When people say women and children are being when people are saying women and children are being killed, They're not talking about 32-year-old IDF soldiers with 17-year-old IDF young boy soldiers going out to like, oh my God, the women and children. Women and children is used to confer like, oh, innocent status. They're just women and children. They're housewives. They're taking their kids or little babies or whatever. Not, you would never.
I would disagree with that, and I think even in the IDFs, even in the hostage exchange proposal, they've made different distinctions for women, even women soldiers than men soldiers, right? So it's like, first we're going to return the hostages, then we're going to return the women soldiers, then we're going to return the male soldiers.
Yes, Hamas makes that distinction. Yeah.
That was Israel's suggestion, not Hamas's.
I thought they were the ones that were saying. I thought because their suggestion.
No. Remember, Hamas was one responding to that proposal, and they said that they would agree to those terms. That was an Israeli proposal. But so it's not just Hamas.
I thought their proposal, because they didn't want to release active military combatants, so they would only release women and children. Maybe it did come from Israel first, because that's what they thought they agreed to. But.
Yeah, it did. I mean, you can look that up. But the bigger reason why I'm making that point is not just about how we sort of definitionally frame women and children.
Sure, but I'm just saying, like, if I'm just on this point, if 100 soldiers go into an area, 100 fully trained, outfitted soldiers, it's 50% women and 50% men, and they went in and they fought, and all 100 soldiers were wiped out, would you really say this particular combat was horrible? 50 women were killed. Would you say that?
But that's not the example. That's not in line with the point that I'm making or the example that I'm giving, right? In that hypothetical, sure. What we're talking about would be, for example, if there were a high school full of people here who were, you're saying by virtue even of them getting training, I'm
saying if they're participating in active military, like for instance, I just pointed out that one child on the, 15, 16, 17, he was a teenager, on the ambulance with the sling and the rock. You were saying that you would refer to that as a child. That's a soldier. That's a militant.
Right, and I'm disagreeing with that. Right, but I'm also saying I'm disagreeing with a few things. One, the examples suggest that there's a significant portion of the Gazan child population that is engaged in this type of combat and training, and and who are engaged as combatants as opposed to just children. And I'm saying that absent data on that, I don't want to concede that point. Or I'm saying, let's look. I need evidence to prove that point. I can't just say, well, that's true because it sounds like it could be true. I don't believe that to be true, and I've seen no evidence that that's true. The second part of that. Hold on one second.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know if you're talking my shot. My circuit breaker flips sometimes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Which, so, like, just on that point, like, for instance, nobody would refer to, like, Rittenhouse as a child, right? Kyle Rittenhouse was a child?
Sure, I would.
Okay. I feel like we have a different understanding of that, but okay.
Yeah, sure. But my bigger point is part of how we're defining Hamas and the ubiquitousness of Hamas is by saying, and it's the same thing we did with the Taliban, right? Is, well, we have to kill. Well, all right, with the Taliban, we understated how many civilians we killed by saying, well, they were soldiers. And we were only defining their soldier status by virtue of the fact that they were old enough to be members of a fighting force, right? So we're saying, well, if they're 15 and male, then they are combatants. So when we blow up that school, that high school, technically, based on that definition, everybody's a combatant. And part of how Israel frames,
I don't think Israel is framing every male dead person as a.
I'm not saying they are. I'm not saying they are. I'm beginning by pointing out, using another example, sort of the danger of assigning combatant status to people by virtue of age, right? In the case of Israel, what they're doing, and even what you're doing right now, is saying, well, there are large numbers of Hamas people there. Right, in this room, in this refugee camp, in this house, right? And part of how Israel defines, and this is part of how Israel justifies saying they're getting at combatants and not civilians, is to, one, loosely define a Hamas loosely define a Hamas connection. When you look at when they say someone has a Hamas connection, or these journalists that were killed weren't real journalists, they were Hamas soldiers, and then you look at how they're defined as being part of Hamas, it's often like, well, they work for state TV, they have a cousin who they met with. Here's a picture of them 5 years ago at a Hamas meeting or wearing a uniform or something of that sort, right? And so we create this broad and loose definition of what it means to be Hamas. And so even if someone is not involved in an act of combat, we still say, well, they may not be a civilian. And the only people we seem to be conceding are civilians all the time are the people who you're narrowly talking about, right? In your example, right, which are the housewives and the 5-year-old, right? But when we look at the number of people who have been killed here, a disproportionate number of them being 28 now, yeah. It's and 2/3 of them being women and children. Now we're saying, well, they're not children. They're Hamas children, they're 14-year-old combatants. They're people on trucks throwing rocks who also shouldn't be killed by snipers.
Do you? This is like we don't have to spend too much longer on this particular topic. Do you know Cat Williams?
Yeah.
Do you followed his kind of downfall when he got quote unquote beat up by the high schooler, right?
I saw the video. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's kind of what I'm talking about, right? When I heard that initially, now listen, as a 5'8", okay, short king, all right, I sympathize with Cat Williams as a fellow short man. When I heard that story, that sounded really funny. How do you get beat up by a high schooler? You said you saw that video though, right? That dude was huge compared to Cat. It's not surprising that he beat the shit out of him. I don't know why. I think Cat even swung first. I was like, bro, you're wild. Oh wait, was that kid in middle school? I'm just saying that, like, I thought it was a high school kid, but I'm just saying that, like, when we say women and children, when we say children are being killed, we're invoking this weird idea that it's like these innocent non-combatants that are dying. I think your combatant status comes first, and then after that we evaluate things like women and children. Like we said before, if a group of 17-year-old boys were going into some place with AK-47s to shoot it up, and they get killed in an operation, we would be like, oh my god, you killed children. They were soldiers first, they were militants first. Same thing when the IDF employs women, we don't say, wow, Hamas is horrible for killing those women soldiers. Now if it's civilians, it's another thing, but I think your militant status, your military status, your combat status comes first in these evaluations, unless we're like an exceptional territory. We're talking about like 6 or 7 or 8-year-olds or something like that. But once
if an 8-year-old were walking down the street with an AK-47 in any country in the world,
if a what?
I would have. If an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old walking down the street with an AK-47, if a 4-year-old walking down the street with an AK-47, and somehow had the physical capacity to wipe out a room, I would expect people to defend themselves as reasonable. I expect them to go use all reasonable precautions to prevent it, but if not, they'd have to defend themselves. I ain't got no problem with that. My issue is not that. My issue is that the framing of combatant status and the framing of eligibility for that category is very loose and broad when we talk about people, particularly often in the Middle East.
Sure.
And that's my point. So no, I agree. If a group of 17-year-olds got AK-47s, I'm not saying check their ID first.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think we largely agree that. But like when Hamas is taking every opportunity to fight among civilians, to disguise themselves among civilians, and to operate and store ammunition and command from civilians, like, yeah, these calculations on Israel's side get way, 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 way harder. And when the argument is given over and over again that they've killed, 40% of the people killed are children, or 58% or 60% are women and children, like the impression given is just that, like, wow, they're just indiscriminately carpet bombing. I think you even used the term carpet bombing these cities to kill people. And it's like, okay, well, how is Israel carpet bombing Gaza, one of the more densely populated areas on the planet, and after however many 20, 30, or no, what was it, like 10,000 bombs or whatever, they've only killed so many people. If they were indiscriminately bombing, why is it that 20 to 30%, at least what Israel claims, dead are Hamas militants? How is that number 3 to 1, 4 to 1, when it's like some of the most densely populated areas ever? Wouldn't we expect to see civilian deaths be like 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 30 to 1? What other urban combat would we compare to this, where we'd go like, wow, they did it way better here than they're doing it right now in Israel? I feel like all the numbers, all the reporting, everything lines up that they're trying to be about as precise as possible, but you're fighting an enemy that literally, like, willingly and openly uses the civilian populations to fight amongst.
What would it look like in a place like Gaza that's not use a civilian population?
What would it look like in Gaza?
Not use a civilian, yeah.
I don't know. There's tons of like there's lots of like kind of rurally area. I think there's like 3 or 4 big cities in Gaza, but like we can bring up a map and look at it. Like there are areas outside of the heavy urban areas that you could operate out of, but the reason why they don't is because the IDF would wipe them out immediately. So they,
yes.
Yeah. But you're laughing, but that's the justification for using human shields. That's not a justification in international law. You can't say like I'm using human shields.
No. I'm not saying they're using human shields. What I'm saying is I'm saying that it is a dense area. I'm saying that it is incredibly difficult to fight in a dense area without being very close to people.
I agree with what you're saying.
No, I know. But just hear this. The part where we're disagreeing is two things. One, I'm saying that rather than conceiving of Hamas often using human shields, I'm suggesting that they're occupying that Israel. I'm looking at it from the opposite side and saying Israel is using the pretext of Hamas is everywhere, and even lumping other non-Hamas folk into that Hamas pile. As a pretext for being fairly indiscriminate in the bombing, because when I bomb when I blow up the mosque like it happened 2 days ago, when you bomb the mosque, you can say, well, yeah, but there's so much Hamas in the area, and so to me, the ability to be more surgical, the ability to be more precise. I mean, Hamas doesn't have the military capacity to be discriminate. Excuse me. When they fire their rockets across, they don't actually have the ability to be indiscriminate. That's not to defend it. It's a war crime. Again, I begin from the place of saying Hamas has committed lots of war crimes. I'm never saying they don't. You know what I mean? But my concern is that what Israel has decided to do is to retaliate, often using similar means, but to a much more dangerous and broad scale, under the pretext of, well, Hamas is hiding everywhere. And when they're asked to present evidence of this, evidence that there is an Al-Shifa hospital command center, the only tunnels and command center we saw was the one that Israel created.
Well, hold on. So firstly, yeah, we did see that massive tunnel, and we saw Hamas additions to those tunnels that were underneath Al-Shifa, because there was a bunker built there, I think 20 years ago, originally, when the settlements were there. But there were additions to that tunnel, and there was new wiring ran that was shown. There were weapons that were located within that hospital. We saw them stored next to MRI machines and everything else, right? That's enough to remove the civilian protection from the hospital.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. It's being used for combat.
So you're saying any weapons in that hospital then makes it no longer a hospital?
Not just throwing a weapon there, but combat operations from within, yeah. And
but there was no evidence. I'm saying there was no evidence.
We literally saw video footage on October 7th of hostages being taken back to that exact hospital. And Amnesty International has been reporting for 10 years that hospital has like an interrogation wing where people are taken and tortured there for suspected collaborators and stuff. So it is used.
Amnesty International has never confirmed that Al-Shifa Hospital was a Hamas command center during the time that it was bombed.
That's true, but they have. Right. But they said in the past that it is. There's no reason to assume
that doesn't meet the legal standard. That's what I'm saying.
I understand. I'm just saying that in the past we know that it has been, and on October 7th we saw video footage of hostages being taken past like 5 or 6 other hospitals to go to Al-Shifa Hospital. We saw them walk in with the hospital on the CCTV into that hospital. So it seems to be the case that they're probably still using it, and we know that the tunnels underneath have new tunnels dug because there's new wiring, and we saw weapons within the hospital. That's a lot of circumstantial evidence that kind of points to the fact that it's probably still being used by Hamas in a military combat operation.
One, that circumstantial evidence can be compelling if there's enough of it. I'm not saying we need a smoking gun, but much of what you're talking about does not amount to, in fact, none of what you talked about amounts to the idea that there was a Hamas command center there.
Wait, why do you keep saying there doesn't have to be a command center for it to be a military?
Because that was their claim. That was literally their claim.
Sure, that might have been their claim. They might have been wrong, but it was used as a military objective, 100%.
No, but it's not like they just were being hyperbolic. The whole point is that they were making a claim that was on its face untrue, and then attempted to support that claim by piecing together random evidence that actually wasn't the case. I'm saying there's reason to trust the claim in the first place.
I would have to look back and see what all the I know I saw as it was being released, the videos and everything, and then the new tunnels underneath. I don't know of anything else. It might have been the fact that it wasn't a command and control center. It might not have been. It might not have been that, but it was still clearly used as a military objective. So, I mean, like nothing that they did here. It's not like they didn't bomb that hospital, right? They just stormed it and they took it over like that.
Wiring. So you're saying that wiring and some weapons makes it a sufficient target?
Yeah. It's a military target. Yeah. It's being used for military purposes. And again, remember the video footage on the day of the hostages being taken in there by Hamas. They're literally using it as a military outpost. Yes.
Yeah, no, we disagree. I need to see that footage. Nothing I've seen, and I've never seen any independent international body, any independent journalistic body, any independent diplomatic body make the case that Israel has demonstrated that Al-Shifa was a military target. And honestly, when pressed on this, the most common response by the Israeli spokespeople is almost like, including the leader of the Mossad who I spoke to, former leader of the Mossad who I spoke to a few days ago, who basically said, well, after October 7th, all bets are off. I mean, that their argument has been more when pressed for evidence, not to provide the evidence, but to say, well, did you see what happened on October 7th? They don't play by the rules. We can't play by the rules, which is to me a very different case than saying, look, here's a persuasive body of evidence. They promised the evidence on Al-Shifa Hospital. I have yet to see it. They've promised this evidence, and I guess the other thing I guess
you're really hung up on this command and conquer thing, or not command and conquer, the C2, the command
only
and control.
Because they made that as the argument.
They might have made that argument. I don't know if they found it justified as being command and control. It is undeniably just the footage alone of the hostages being. But you haven't seen that CCTV footage of the hostages being taken to Al-Shifa Hospital.
If hostages are taken into Al-Shifa Hospital,
yeah,
and then relocated, that does not then mean that you can bomb the hospital.
I don't think they bombed that hospital. That
was or shoot up the hospital.
I don't think they shut up the hospital. I think they just sieged it and then they moved in. I don't think they blew up the hospital or were like artillery shelling, destroying the.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to disagree on that, right? But we can. This is provable stuff. But so we can just look it up.
Sure.
But I guess my bigger question for you on this point, but also to the bigger question, why do you trust the Israeli government's claims so much? Because much of your arguments rest on the Israeli government telling the truth when they consistently have not.
So I think that the Israeli government has every incentive to lie. I don't think we should just believe what they say. So I think what you look at is you try to look at other parties that will verify things. I tend to trust the United States here. And you'll look at what international human rights people are saying, and then you'll look at other journalists that are being allowed to look at stuff and then what they're saying. And then we kind of like look at the numbers and then we see basically what's going on. So for instance, let's say that it was the case that like 3 hospitals get JDAM'd, get bombed, completely obliterated. And you're looking at the news, you're like, okay. And then let's say that the Gazan Health Ministry reports 5,000 dead between the 3 hospitals. That's a pretty huge thing, okay? You're bombing hospitals directly. You've got 5,000 reported civilian deaths. At that point, I'd be like, I need to see some really strong evidence that there were civilians here. And it's not enough for Israel to just say, well, hey, look, we believe there was stuff. I think the videos that they've been releasing, I think the other journalists that they let come in to look at the October 7th stuff, the stuff that they published about it, I think that the ICG...
Who?
Like who, what?
So,
and in response to the October 7th stuff, there were tons of international journalists. Israel made, I think they've even got a website now where they made available a lot of the evidence and photographs and everything they had of that particular event.
So October 7th isn't what we're talking about, right?
Well, that part was October 7th. For the military operations in the Gaza Strip, we're looking at like civilian to militant casualties.
Yeah, so what human rights organizations have affirmed that Israel has used reasonable precautions in the Gaza Strip to prevent civilian deaths? Because I've seen not one.
Well, I don't think you would attest that they're using reasonable cautions. You would take issue if they weren't. And I think generally all of the language that I see is Israel needs to be cautious. So for instance, even for like the ICJ stuff, they were saying, hey, make sure you guys are being careful that you're not genociding people. Like make sure that you're not doing this and like give us a report in a month to see how it's going.
So Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, UN, UNRWA, also UNHCR, but I'll just say UNRWA for now. All of them have expressed concern with Israel's tactics,
which is fair.
So when I asked the question, well, what human rights organizations are you said if the reason you wouldn't just trust Israel on its face, or the reason you would believe Israel is not because they said it, but because it's been substantiated by these other bodies. And when I'm asking which of these other bodies have substantiated it, they've actually done the opposite.
Expressing caution is not done the opposite, right? Anytime there's a military anything, you would expect.
No. They've done more. Okay, so but
Well, has anybody like said like Israel is violating international law?
Yes, Alberto Guterres has done that. The head of the UN, Francesca Albanese has done that.
Have they said Israel is violating international law? Or are they saying
Yes.
it would be a violation of international law
they're
if
saying
Israel
they are. They're saying they are.
If you want, I'm curious. You can shoot me an article and we can read through it right now. I'm curious what the particular claim is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, I'll do that right now. But again, your claim was, I believe Israel because it's been. I don't believe any nation state on their face. I believe it when other people substantiate it.
Yeah.
I'm saying, but when I ask who has substantiated, you're simply saying they haven't not substantiated it.
No. When you asked me for the substantiation, we're mixing a little bit. I was talking about the October 7th attacks, was where a lot of independent journalists or other nations' journalists were brought in, and they were allowed to look at basically all the footage and the evidence, the forensic stuff collected, and then make their evaluations on what happened. That would have been
on the Hamas attack. Yes, on the Hamas attack, absolutely.
For the stuff going on the attacks in Gaza, other people are trying to verify the numbers. I mean, at the end of the day, these all come from the Gazan Health Ministry and the IDF, which are really the only two sources we can rely on. And then U.S. intelligence making statements or open source intelligence making statements about, like, for instance, initially people had claimed that Israel had bombed the parking lot of that one hospital, and a ton of independent people looked into it, and they arrived at the conclusion that it was most likely a mortar failure or something. These are the types of things I'm looking at. I wouldn't just go by Israel saying, like, oh, look, we said this thing, or by video footage and stuff that Israel's releasing, and like evaluating that and looking at other people's evaluations of that. I agree that we shouldn't just take Israel at face value.
Right, but what I'm saying is, no. First of all, Israel is blocked. So there's a couple of things here. One, again, the organizations are saying that these are, and again, we may say, well, we don't trust the UN, but the UN organizations have expressed not just grave concern, although that is a thing, right? To say, hey, we're trying to give humanitarian aid, we're being blocked. We are trying. Electricity has been cut off. We're asking Israel to undo what it's done. If Israel does X and the human rights organizations say stop doing X in order to not violate international law, that is saying you're violating international law.
Like I said, I read the ICJ opinion, and they didn't say to stop doing X. They just said, be careful. There's a possibility that you might be genociding people. Like, you need to take every precaution and be careful. They didn't say stop the military operation.
But that's not exculpatory, right?
I didn't say it was exculpatory. I'm just saying.
No.
Yeah. Or go on.
What I'm saying is, the purpose of that hearing was not to make a determination about whether or not they were committing genocide.
Correct. It was a statutory thing, basically.
Right.
Like, yeah.
So, right. So. It's like if I get accused of robbing a bank and I go in for my preliminary hearing and my lawyer's like, can we drop this charge? And the judge looks at the video footage of me with a mask on and says, there's reason to think you might have done this. We're gonna proceed to trial. And then I walk out saying, the judge didn't say I was guilty. Judge didn't say I robbed. Of course not. That wasn't what it was for.
Sure.
And Israel has actually trumpeted that decision or the response of the court in a way that would suggest that somehow the court's failure to say that they were committing genocide, or in my example, the judges or jury's decision to say that I didn't rob the bank, is somehow evidence that I wasn't doing something wrong.
I 1,000,000,000% agree. It could be that in 1 month, the ICJ, because you're correct, I agree with you, this ruling was to make sure that South Africa had grounds to bring the case, and that prima facie it looked like it could have been, is there a genocide happening? Well, they looked at the facts, like, well, there's a lot of civilian deaths, there's been a lot of crazy statements, I agree, by Israeli leadership.
Yes.
It's possible, we'll look into it. I'm not citing that to say, like, oh, well, look, they didn't say to stop right now, right? You're at pre-trial, so you must be innocent. I'm just saying that I'm not aware of any credible organization that said, we are saying 100% this is a war crime. I'll see a lot of things saying, like, if Israel targeted this hospital just to kill civilians, that's a war crime. Or if Israel continues to do this would be a war crime. Collective punishment, if they engage in this, that's a war crime. But I haven't heard any resolute statements of, like, and I might have just missed those. That's why I'm just curious if, like, for an article.
First of all, groups like the UN are never going to say you're committing the war crime because they have an actual court to make that determination. So just as a diplomatic matter, they rarely will say you're doing this.
Okay, that's fair, but that's a different statement earlier when you were like, they've said they're committing war crimes.
I'm only speaking about the UN.
Sure. Okay, go ahead. Sorry,
I'm only speaking about the UN.
Okay.
I'm going to the other ones, but the other ones have said that. But I'm saying the UN won't say that. What the UN will say is, similar to what the ICJ said, is, look, there's a chance you're committing war crimes. We're not saying you're committing war crimes, but it's plausible you are. These statements sound crazy. It sounds like you're advocating genocide. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you not to do these 4 things.
Yeah.
Right? And what are those 4 things? The literal textbook definition of genocide. It would be like the judge saying, look, I'm not saying you robbed a bank, but what I am going to say is, until trial, don't go in any banks, don't wear any ski masks, don't slip any notes to tellers. I'm not saying you're a bank robber, but I am saying, like, in the future, don't request sums of money that aren't in your account. You know, and that's effectively what the court did. They're saying, we're not saying you did, but we're saying the emergency measure was designed to stop them from doing the things that they're doing. Now, the problem is, and I think this is where, again, the differential interpretations of international law come in, is that Israel's saying, well, that's what we've always been doing. We've always taken reasonable precaution. Yeah. We've always done all the things. And so Israel's definition of reasonable precaution is wildly different, I think, than the bulk of the international community.
Potentially, which is why I think it's good that the ICJ, as part of that ruling, said you need to prepare a report in 1 month and then we'll go over it. I think that was a good thing for the ICJ to do, and I would hope that Israel would, to some extent, as best they can, participate in that to hopefully exonerate themselves in the eyes of the International Court of Justice. I think that was a good thing for them to do. Yeah.
Oh no, I think you're right about I'm pulling up an article simultaneously now. I think you're right. The ICJ's decision was important. The ICJ's involvement was important. I hope the ICC's involvement will also come in soon, so that we can actually have an international body. I mean, Israel's already said, though, no matter what the ICJ says, we're not going to do anything different. So again, if the courts rule that these are war crimes being committed, Israel's saying we're still going to do the same thing. So again, Israel's position is not, we don't think we're committing war crimes, but let's let a dispassionate third party decide. They're saying we're going to do what we're going to do regardless.
I understand that that's true, but I think we both agree, though, that there is going to be some, like, tough talk from politicians that won't completely line up with military action. So, for instance, there have been, I won't even say borderline, there have been, like, genocidal statements made by some Israeli leaders or some members of the Israeli government, for sure. And they say those things, and, you know, they're in a post-October 7th mindset, and they want to, you know, look tough to their civilian population. But I think it's pretty clear when you look at how the military is operating that they are trying their best to stay within the corridors of international law, because they know that if they, like, for instance, that Israel lost a lot of international support in the days following that parking lot explosion, when people were accusing them of having blown up that hospital. Israel's response to that, and you can see when they get accused of things like that, their response to the white flag thing when they shot those 3 Israeli hostages, their response to that hospital parking lot bombing that people initially accused them of, their response wasn't, well, we said we were going to do whatever we want. Fuck you guys. We're going to do whatever we want. We're big dogging it. We don't care about you guys. They were like, hold on. This was a huge it's kind of like when Russia, like, saber rattles and, like, we're moving our nukes because we're going to bomb you guys. But they do everything very much in the open so that the rest of the world can see, so that they're not going to do people, right? Yeah, I agree with you that the rhetoric is troubling. I'm trying to look at action on the ground. And I think for the most part, when you look at the civilian deaths, which are tragic, but you look at the percentage of military people killed, or at least claimed by Israel to be killed, and you look at the actions so far, it doesn't. What?
I say which we disagree on. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. What do you think is like or actually, wait, if you want to find that article,
here's something from Amnesty to give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Amnesty International visited the site of the strike on 2 occasions. These are 2 military strikes that took place in private homes. I'll give you the date in a second. I'll shoot you the article as well. But this article is recent. It's February 12th. So it's today the 12th. Yeah. But and this is how Amnesty International, and you know the diplomatic or the language of these organizations, I'll just say. What they said was, let me see. I lost my place, but give me 1 second. They basically said that there was no. Amnesty International's research did not find evidence that any of those staying in the house that was directly hit were affiliated with an armed group. The organization's research also did not find any indication that there were military objectives in or near the houses.
Are we talking about is this the Goldstone report, or
No. This is the Goldstone report is from before. Which,
from a long time ago. Is this right now from
this strike? No, I'm talking about in Rafah now.
Okay, the Rafah. Okay, gotcha. Just making sure. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about now. I mean, we go to the Goldstone report, which is its own fiasco.
Do you want to link me real quick what you're reading, just so I can have it up on screen?
Yeah. What's the? I'll DM it to you real quick. Oh wait, I'm a little tech challenged here. All right, I can probably copy it right into here. I think
if you want, on the bottom of the Zoom, if you click, there might be a more button where it says there's like a chat. You can.
I was trying to see if I'm hooked to the same Wi-Fi, I can copy from my iPhone and paste it through my computer. I'm on 2 devices. That's what I'm.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. While you're doing that, I'm just curious. Where did you said you're a professor? Where do you teach at? Do you say that publicly?
City University of New York, CUNY Graduate Center.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. Gotcha.
Yeah. It's not working, but if you go to here, I'll just pull up on the computer. It'll be easier that way.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I teach there. I've just started there actually. It was at Temple University for years.
What's that? Are you teaching like the same level of student, or are you?
Yeah, well, I teach only. Before I taught some undergrad and a lot of grad students. Now I only teach grad students. The Graduate Center is sort of a. The idea is that we only do graduate students there. It's sort of like it was designed like the CUNY system was like it's all over New York, all the City College, Hunter College, Brooklyn College, etc. And then in the 40s and 50s they created like a kind of PhD granting center that would sort of meet the needs of the entire city of New York. Sort of like it's like the public Ivy kind of situation, I guess they would call it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. It's a pretty cool place to be. Paul Krugman's there. It's a lot of big time scholars are there.
Gotcha. Yep. Oh yeah, that link worked. Thanks. Awesome.
Okay, let me see. I want to make sure that's the one I sent you. Yeah, I think that's the one I want to make sure it's the same one I'm reading.
Okay. New evidence of unlawful Israeli attacks in Gaza causing massive civilian casualties amid real risk of genocide. Okay, so we can read more of this if you want. I have no problem doing that. I'm guessing you've read this. So one of my issues sometimes for reporting like this is for a civilian attack. Or I'm sorry, let me be very precise with my language. And then you can tell me if you disagree on the international law on this. If Israel bombs a place and the target is civilians, that is a war crime. You cannot explicitly target civilians. That would be a war crime. Right. If Israel targets a place and there's a military combatant there, but say there's like one ordinary soldier and 100 civilians, and it's almost impossible to make a war effort argument for that much collateral damage, we would consider that a war crime. Now, if there's like 10 key commanders and 100 civilians, well, the proportionality cost gets murky, maybe not a war crime. Here's a fourth scenario that I think is really hard, and it's frustrating when I read these sometimes. There's a big frustration I have with the Goldstone report is, if it's the case, so when Amnesty International investigates, and it looks like 95 civilians, nearly half of the children, killed in 4 unlawful strikes in Rafah. I'm guessing, since you linked me this, the argument that this is going to make is when they did an investigation in the area, there is no evidence that there were military objectives there.
That's literally what they say. Yeah, there was no indication there was no military objectives in or near the houses.
Yep.
And that no one in the house that was hit
was like related to Hamas or anything, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So I think this points in a concerning direction. However, if it was the case that Israel had intelligence at the time or had reason to believe that these were military objectives, it wouldn't be a war crime or a contravention of international law if they did do these strikes, which is one of the reasons why sometimes it's frustrating when these reports are put out and there's no pressure on Israel or there's no reach out to Israel to corroborate why did you do this particular attack. As another example, do you remember after we pulled out of Afghanistan, I believe the United States drone struck, I think it was a Doctors Without Borders hospital. I think a lot of civilians were. It was a horrific. It just sucked. But the reason why that wasn't considered a war crime is because the United States most likely wasn't intentionally trying to kill doctors. There was really bad intel that led to a bad attack, but it wasn't an.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. I think that's totally fair. I think the difference is with Israel, we hear case after case, house after house, refugee camp after refugee camp. We keep hearing, "Oh, we thought there was Hamas there," and all we see is family members, or we see a case where they'll say that someone has some loose affiliation with a terrorist or an armed group. And so we either have to believe that Israel's really bad at this, or we could believe that they are deliberately targeting civilians, right? Which is not necessarily my argument.
Sure, that's fair.
My argument is actually that they're wildly indifferent to whoever they hit.
Sure. So I think the two things I would look at, so I think we both agree, the idea of them like, I'm going to kill this family, probably not happening, because that would be crazy. The argument that you're making is more reasonable.
I'm not completely dismissing that.
Okay, we won't completely dismiss it, but we'll say that's probably a low. But if I'm steel manning your position, if I was to argue your side, I would say maybe Israel's not intentionally targeting them, but the level of discretion that they're using is almost non-existent if they happen to do 4 separate strikes in Rafah where there are no military targets found. Whatever proportionality analysis or intelligence using is woefully inadequate to minimize the risk to civilian casualties, right?
That's right.
So I think that that's a good starting point. We just have to dig into the Israeli side to see their justification for the attack, which I understandably leads to the frustration of like, well, sometimes Israel doesn't always participate. in evidence gathering. So, for instance, for the Goldstone report, I think Israel explicitly
almost
said
never participate in evidence gathering.
Yeah, true. And it's hard to compel a state to do so as long as the state has their own investigatory bodies. Because again, remember the Geneva Conventions, you want everybody to participate, and nobody really wants to submit themselves to the ICJ, like having full authority over things, unless there's really, really, really good reason to do so. But like, I would agree, for instance, that this points in a concerning direction, but does not a war crime make, I would say.
So, if we were talking, I mean, nation states in general are violent and bloody, and so again, I don't think Israel is uniquely such. I think they're just at a particular moment in their historical development that's different than Australia or the United States or other countries or Canada or other countries that, they got their hands dirty much longer ago, and so we kind of look at it as a historical relic as opposed to people who are still here fighting. But nevertheless, it would be much easier to accept Israel's perspective, obviously, if not for international human rights organizations like Amnesty, if not for the UN, but also it would also be such, it would also be easier if Israel hasn't, from the very beginning, from its very formation, been structured to do this very thing. Right, Israel is a settler colonial state.
Sure. Wait, real quick before we go from this point, okay?
Yeah.
I have to put just a quick pin on this, okay? Because I had very low expectations when I saw your Twitter account and everything else. I assume it's going to be a wild debate. This has been the best conversation I've had on this so far, so I'm super grateful for the conversation so far. Thank you so much. I just want to say one point of agreement I think we can have is I wish there was a better compulsionary body that can force countries somehow, I don't know what that would look like, to make available some evidence of the attacks they do. Because I think we can both agree on this. It might be the case that in every single Israeli attack, they really did have good intel, or they were trying their best, and unfortunately, highly dense populated areas, shit happens. And if I'm being good faith, I would have to acknowledge there could be the case that sometimes Israel, in the post-October 7th fervor, in like the heat of military shit, they don't do a good proportionality cost. And like, you know what, fuck it, we might lose 2 soldiers, it's gonna look bad in an election, just fucking bomb this house, maybe we'll take it out, hopefully nobody notices. I think that the photos, the videos of those 3 guys with the white flags getting shot, that should be a wake-up call to people that blindly defend all IDF reporting, because it's like, hey, if they shot 3 guys that were hostages, would we have even heard about this if they were Palestinians? Would we even know? Or is this happening regularly? So I wish there was a way to make that information available on some level of compulsion, which is why I think the ICJ case, from what I understand, is good, because it forces them to file that report with the International Court of Justice to hopefully at least give them some insight to make a determination. I think that would be, I don't know how you do that because of states being unwilling to participate in those things, but yeah.
And Israel being particularly unwilling to do that. They've never let any UN rapporteur in, including the current present one, Francesca Albanese. They've been very, very cagey about letting journalists in, and when they do, they've guided them to very specific areas. And even people who are fairly middle of the road, like Clarissa Ward at CNN, when they see it, they're like, "This is awful," right? When you look at when you look at ICC in the past, they're not party to the Rome Statute. When you look at every effort to participate, Israel has largely said no thanks, right? Yeah. And not just them. Again, the United States is really bad at participating in this stuff too.
I mean, the U.S. literally, if somebody went to Hague, like we would go to war with them. I think we said that explicitly. You're never holding U.S. soldiers to account under the International Court of Justice. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of us are bad at this stuff. Mm-hmm. But again, to the point for me is that Israel is not simply engaged in an unforeseeable or unforeseen war.
Sure. Real quick to hit on that, and I think this is an issue that the international community has coming up, is Israel's kind of for these kinds of excuses all the time has always been, we feel like the international community is against us or holds us to unfair standards. And I think the things that they point to can argue are toothless condemnation. So they might say, why does Amnesty International spend so much time condemning us? Why is the United Nations passed more resolutions on us than literally every other country combined? Why is it that 63 or whatever Muslim majority countries are always voting in a block to condemn us? This feels unfair. And, maybe Israel complains, maybe they really just are in the wrong, and that's why people are, complaining about them. Or maybe they are kind of in the wrong, and there's people that have potential bias against them, but, that's still something they need to address. But I think something that really hurts a lot of the international case as of recently, and maybe we disagree on the facts for some of this, I think a lot of the stuff coming out about the UN RWA relating to, first it was just 12 Hamas people that were participating on October 7th that were part of the UNRWA. Now, I think the highest number that I saw was maybe around 10% of them are part of it. And then now I think it was either just today or yesterday. It was there was like a massive military facility right underneath. I think it was a UNRWA headquarters that they're all claiming they didn't know about. And my final point was that very hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital, that there were workers at, doctors saying, no, we've never seen people use this as a terrorist base. We've never seen Hamas people. Well, footage came out later that because those statements were made after October 7th. Well, on October 7th, we saw hostages being taken into that hospital. So I think Israel probably feels a little bit vindicated. Like, well, look, some of these international orgs are trying to fuck us, especially the UNRWA. How do you expect us to trust them?
Yeah, I think the UNRWA has been a thorn in Israel's side since 1949. I'll say since 1948, frankly. And they've done everything they can to discredit UNRWA, and certainly in the Netanyahu era. Discrediting UNRWA has been a primary project of his, and when Trump was in office, he effectively managed to not shut it down, but dismantle it considerably by cutting all the U.S. funding out of it. The argument that first it was 12 people, you're right. When we look at the dossier, according to sources, again, Channel 4 News,
Sure.
Daily Beast, I haven't seen it. I can't. I'm completely transparent.
Yep.
I'd love to see it. Have not seen it. But when I look at it, when I look at what's been reported, that number seems to drop from 12 to like 6. And what's in the actual dossier, and there's no substantiated evidence in any of it. No person who has seen the dossier, no journalist, no independent organization who has seen the dossier has made the case that Israel has given proof of these relationships. That's the first thing.
Okay.
Now, and the second piece of it, to your other point, which was the 10%. I heard that number too. I've heard 10%. I've even heard 30%. I have Hamas affiliations, but again, how you define a Hamas affiliation is very, very important in a place where Hamas is not simply some rogue militant group that took over. This isn't Daesh, right? This isn't ISIS or ISIL, right? This is the government. This is a democratically elected government that has control over state facilities. So if I am a doctor at El Ahli Hospital, you might say that I have a Hamas affiliation. Just like the journalist who works for state radio was said to be a Hamas affiliated
propaganda outlet or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, a Hamas affiliated journalist.
Sure. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. So it's
just to be super clear, I wish I could find it. I do agree, and I even tweeted out on the day that 10% was announced, because the wording on that, I wish I could remember the original outlet. The wording was pretty ambiguous, and obviously Hamas is the government in the area. So when they said 10% have like ties to Hamas, I think that does have to be really carefully evaluated, because Hamas is the literal fucking government. So what do we mean when we say that?
Right.
Because that number could blow up to a huge amount. That's the same thing as saying like, oh, this guy was CIA affiliated because like his dad was in the CIA, or this guy, works for the feds because he was an informant and he informed one time 20 years ago, right? So I agree with you, and I even tweeted that out on the day that we had to be careful.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But you realize that that's also the problem with saying our intelligence says there's Hamas folk in that house or in that refugee camp or in that village. It's those very same standards are being given. That's my point.
Sure, potentially. But I mean, like for the UNRWA stuff, I'm pretty sure their head dropped out, and I'm pretty sure like several, I think even humanitarian groups have condemned UNRWA now. Now I don't know if they're just rushing prematurely or something, but
no. What the head said was what he said was he said we fired the people to give the appearance of propriety. He said, basically, we did the reverse of innocent until proven guilty, so we could keep this train going. So there would be no risk of looking like we're not cooperative and like we're not, like we have something to hide. We fired 12 people, some of whom had no connection to anything, like even remotely. We don't even get it, but we did it anyway. And then the more we looked, the more we realized we had no reason to fire them. They're more frustrated, and yet still, the United States and other countries did what? They cut the funding.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I'm guessing because normally they're pretty resistant to Israel screaming like, "Oh, this is bullshit, this is bias, blah blah blah." The fact that they're cutting funding now, I think. I'm sorry. Also, the head of the UNRWA did not drop out. My bad.
Yeah, I was going to
say, people are actually cutting funding. I mean, it probably. I'm guessing they saw something. I need to dig.
No, he explicitly said no. I mean, we can question his motives. We can say maybe he doesn't mean what he said, but what he actually said was there was no reason. I did it. I did it to basically to play ball with you guys, and basically like I mean, I'll put it in layman's terms. But basically, what he said is, I did all this shit to make you guys happy, so you wouldn't think I was part of it, and then you cut the funding anyway, right? I mean, that's basically what he said. I was trying to see if I could get his exact quote here. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there was no evidence of it, and I think that's what's frustrating. Not to mention, I mean, we won't even talk about the timing of it coming out on the day of the ICJ decision. It seemed like just an opportunity to discredit the UN and to discredit the whole process and say even the body that's making the determination about us is in on the fix.
Yeah, but I feel like I'm trying to think. I'm trying to rack my brain because I don't hear many statements. I feel like the United States is the big supporter of Israel. I don't know if like Europe is as necessarily bought into the whole Israel outfit as the U.S. is. I feel like
Germany. You wouldn't say that about Germany.
I feel like if European countries are starting to cut funding, like more than just like, a Muslim majority country, I feel like there's probably something there. But admittedly, like, I need to look more.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, no country has said that there's anything there. Again. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying like I don't trust them or I don't believe them. They themselves are saying, look,
sure.
What they said is we're going to do an investigation, but we're going to cut funding until the investigation, which is sort of ironic given the fact that they're dropping a shitload of money into Israel's coffers while waiting for an ICJ investigation, while waiting for an ICJ decision, while waiting for other international bodies to make decisions. They're effectively saying Israel will be funded until proven guilty. Mm-hmm. They probably funded even if proven guilty, whereas they're saying UNRWA will only be funded if the investigation proves to not be the case. And what I'm hearing in back channel wise, and some reports are saying this, is that the U.S. expects to refund UNRWA. They expect the money to start flowing again. But you look really bad. It's one thing to say, look, UNRWA is shitty and for all these reasons. So, but we're going to keep funding them because it's the lifeblood. But when you say it's connected to October 7th, which is like saying 9/11, you know what I mean? You now have to pull back just for optics' sake. And Israel played this masterfully. They left nations with no choice.
Maybe, I guess. Did you see the story that came out like very recently? I think it was in the past week with the huge data center that was uncovered under the Gaza headquarters. That the ones where all the UNRWA workers were like, we had no idea this was under there, but it was like a massive data center that was used by Hamas. I think this came out just a few days ago.
I did not see that. I need to take. Just give me 1 second. I just need to make one quick phone call.
Yeah, you're good. I disagree with this guy a lot, but this guy's like has the best engagement. He's like responding to things that I'm saying. I feel like he's not farming for TikTok clips, and our disagreements I think are relatively substantive. So Jesus, I thought this was going to be a 30-minute screaming match. We were going to be done. So. Especially because this guy, he didn't seem like anybody that billed himself as like a foreign policy Israel-Palestine expert. He just seemed like a professor. So the fact that he seems to be like one of the best combos we've had so far for this was really shocking to me. Isn't it bad faith to say the ICJ ruling is not a point in favor of Israel? They could have made orders to stop the operations. I would say, if anything, be very cautious. I would say that the ICJ ruling is a very slight hit against Israel. My understanding, and I skimmed this, it was an 11-page report, and I skimmed it. So I'm being honest, I might have missed something, but because a lot of people are saying that report said stuff that it didn't. But when I skimmed it, it seemed like the purpose of that ICJ report was to analyze the complaint from South Africa and then see prima facie, are there enough facts here? And does South Africa have the standing to bring this particular case to the ICJ? Given the facts that they presented, is it reasonable to assume that there might be a case here that the ICJ has jurisdiction under, that the South Africa has standing to bring, and that the crime of genocide might actually be being committed? And that when the ICJ looked at all of the facts, they said, well, it's plausible. There are a lot of civilian deaths. There are crazy statements by Israeli leaders. And then they looked at South Africa and they say they have reason to bring this case. They totally have standing to do it. And then from there, they think they can compel Israel to file a report at the end of the month saying like, hey, you need to prove to us that this isn't happening because we think that South Africa has made a valid argument to bring this case here. Yeah, so I would say if anything, it was like a slight point against Israel. I wouldn't say it favors them. It was just like a pre-evidentiary thing that said that, well, this is possible that this is going on, is what I said, yeah. Sorry. How's it going?
Yeah.
Historical. You wanted to do the settler colonial thing, yeah.
It's just a nation that is founded on ethnic cleansing, right, and on transfer. It stretches credulity to suggest, to think that at every opportunity they've done both of those things, that suddenly now, as people are literally saying, we want to resettle people. Now they've talked about voluntary resettlement, to be sure, to be fair, but that voluntary resettlement. They've also talked about voluntary deporting, voluntary. They use these voluntary words while creating impossible conditions for staying. They've pleaded for the Egyptian government to receive these people. They've chided the Arab leaders for not taking more Palestinians, when at every moment when they've done that, they haven't been allowed back in, whether it's 48, whether it's 67. And so I think a big part of this for me is the historical backdrop to it. There's literally no reason to believe that Israel's doing anything other than what it's always done.
Sure.
And this has been the method.
So I don't know how much time you have, and we don't have to dig into the whole history. When I look at 48, when I look at 67, and then when I look at all of the surrounding Arabs versus the basically European Jews, and I look at the history of the conflict, the way that it seems to me is that I think that Israel, if you look at early statements, whether we're talking Theodore Herzl or whether we're talking Ben-Gurion and all the following, IDF turned to prime ministers, it seems like Israel has always wanted to expand, right? Eretz Israel, I think, is what a lot of them would call it. We need to have greater Israel, this whole thing. It seemed like that was always the goal, but I think that all of the Israeli leadership has been relatively realistic in that they know that they need some sort of international ally. They know they need some sort of international community. Otherwise, Israel's in a sea alone against a bunch of enemies that will destroy her. It feels like, while I'm sympathetic towards that argument that Israel's always tried to expand, I think the problem historically is that all of the surrounding Arabs have always given Israel a really good reason to do so. That all of the territory that Israel has acquired, even if initially maybe we were thinking like, oh, it seems like that's kind of shady, the surrounding states have always given them either a casus belli for war or just a really valid reason to acquire territory. And we can go through any of the individual territory acquisitions and then argue the historical context around this, but I feel that very strongly about all the territory that Israel has acquired.
Yeah, but you begin from the premise that it's illegal to acquire land by force, right?
Well,
we don't begin there, then.
Well, the issue is, like, what do we mean when we say that? So I think that one thing that we run into is we take a modern framing of the issue and then we retroactively superimpose this on Israel, Palestine, and then we try to make arguments that I don't think make the most amount of sense. So let me say this. So Resolution 242 agreed with you that you don't take land through military acquisition, right? And Israel made a commitment to give some territory back. Now they fought very hard for the wording on that, not all of it, but to return some territory back after the 67 war. But the issue is that the initial territory that was acquired was all through military conquest, which makes this particular situation very murky to sort out. So in 48, there was no country in mandatory Palestine. Well, in 47, there was no country. In 48, when Israel declared independence, they were the only country that existed in mandatory Palestine. All of the other acquired territory came through military conquest. Syria moved in from the north. Jordan took the west bank of the River Jordan, and Egypt took the entire Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Now, all of that territory, Israel is the only party there that technically kind of was owed that territory because that was the only country that emerged from the mandatory Palestine period. All of the other neighbors around her took that territory through conquest. And nobody seemed to care that much then. They all called to go back to the partition plan borders. But then, once the Six-Day War happened in 67 and Israel conquered all the territory, now people are like, well, hold on. You can't have territory acquired through conquest. You need to give that back. We'll give it back to who? Because the Jordan... go ahead.
So couple corrections there. So, I mean, the all right. So the UN... If by that position we'd be ignoring a couple of points, including the UN partition plan itself, and who the land was designated for. I'm sorry, give me 10 seconds. I'm just trying to.
You're totally fine. Yeah, no problem.
Manage something here.
Yep.
50. And I'm not good at doing two things at once.
Yeah, you're fine.
West.
Oh shit.
This is an interesting platform too to okay.
Yeah, some people in chat were saying that you've done mainstream media appearances, and obviously as like a YouTuber, and as I talk to more, like congressmen and everything, sometimes those appearances are fun, but it's really, really, really frustrating when somebody brings you on for like, give me your 120-second take on Israel Palestine. It's like, well, fuck, what, you just want me like to give 2 talking points and then be done with it?
Exactly, exactly. That's the great thing about this platform, is that there's time to flesh things out and to think and to talk. And I've been doing more of this thing. I'm new to YouTube. Hopefully folk will check out my channel. I'm new to it, so it's all kind of fun to me to realize it doesn't have to be. I mean, I've been a TV host for a long time, and so the idea of like, oh, this needs to be perfect, or this needs to look a certain way, or I can't just say hold on for a second while I send an Uber for my daughter, like those kinds of things, and she's stuck. It's like those kinds of things that are like, oh, this is actually not the worst thing. So
how old are your children?
Oh man, they run the range of. I have a 23-year-old, a soon-to-be 20-year-old in 2 weeks, and a 1-year-old.
Jeez. Okay. Damn.
Yeah, man. So obviously the 1-year-old is not the one getting the Uber, but it's the college student who somehow still needs lots of stuff, even though she's an adult.
What is it like? Also, this is way too personal to answer. What is it like after having raised older kids, and then so many years later, you're like, okay, another 1-year-old? Is it like, this is awesome, I've got like another baby again? Is it like, this is so much easier what's the third time around?
It's all those things. You have perspective, right? Because you're patient and you're thoughtful about things, and you're like, okay, this will be fine. This isn't the biggest disaster in the world because it'll work out, right? Like they'll be fine, right? And then there's a way that it's just a young man's sport. And you wake up at 3 a.m. To pick up a baby, and my back doesn't have the same idea as my brain does, and my back is like, what the fuck are you doing? You're 45. Why do you have a 1-year-old? But on the whole, it's amazing. It's wonderful. Every stage of raising every kid is amazing in a certain way. At the same time that it's frustrating and challenging and terrifying and all. It's like everything at once, which is kind of neat. But I highly recommend it for all who want parts. So the idea here, and this is a common narrative that people say, right? Which is, no one cared when the Arabs had the occupied territory. No one cared when Jordan was occupying East Jerusalem. It's only when Jews got it, right? Which is a compelling argument. It's just not accurate. I mean, part of it is the default position in 1948, from 1948 to 1967, the Arab world was that Israel was not a legitimate state.
Yep.
And they were holding that land with the intention of returning it to the Palestinian people, and returning all of historic Palestine to them, not just the Golan, not just Gaza, not just the Sinai, not just East Jerusalem, but that all of these historical lands, all of Mandate Palestine, will return to the Arabs or to the Palestinians. Now that's obviously, in retrospect, probably not. It's somewhat quixotic, but that was the thought process. And Jordan also had very specific arrangements with the Israeli state about returning. They had agreed even before 1948 or before 1960, or before both, at different times, with the burgeoning Israeli state around those lands. And so it was never like, okay, we want the Golan, we want the Sinai, and frankly, no one ever really wanted Gaza. Gaza's never been a place people really wanted. When you look at the history of Gaza. But so the Arab position wasn't, it's okay if we have it, it's not okay if Jews have it. It was, this is Palestinian land, and at some point it needs to return to them. After the 1967 war, when Israel increased its control and attained effective control over all of those. Take one more second. I got a little tech issue too. Give me 1 second.
Gotta unplug something here. Jesus. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, the default position after 1967, after Israel attained so much more land, was that this was in a military occupation, and again, that this land had to be ultimately returned. I get the idea of saying we can't take old frameworks and apply them, but these aren't ancient frameworks. I mean, the no land, the idea of not acquiring land through force is one of the spoils of World War I. I mean, the formation of the League of Nations, the idea that we don't have empires anymore, but we have nations, is fundamentally to avoid this very thing. And even though, again, the United States wasn't part of it, other civilized nations were. And by 1948, it was very clear. And you're right when you bring up 1967 and UN Resolution 242, and we could also, 242 and 338 kind of operated in tandem with one another. One to say, hey, we're going to stop all belligerent activity, we're gonna stop all fighting, and then second to say, hey, we're going to respect the territorial integrity of Israel. That's important, and that's what the right to exist discourse was. That's what the right to exist meant. It didn't mean
respect the territorial integrity of. Are we talking about 67 or?
Yeah, I'm talking about UN Resolution 242.
Okay,
I'm saying it was a post 1967 war determination that was effectively saying we need to respect Israel's territorial integrity. I.e., Israel has it was the first affirmation of Israel's right to exist. That discourse obviously got co-opted later to mean something else, to mean exist as a Jewish state and all these other things. But at the core, it meant territorial integrity. It meant you can't take. Again, we're not taking Israel by force. Israel's here to stay. This was a UN sort of backed commitment that the global community enforced. And even in the aftermath of 67, even when Martin Luther King is talking about Israel, right? He's using that same language of 242, the right to exist, meaning territorial integrity. And so we were kind of all on the same page as a global community about what that meant. But what's the territory, right? It didn't mean the Golan Line. It didn't mean the Sinai. And we know in the 70s, obviously after the October War and other things, we saw the return of some of that land. But fundamentally, the idea here was that a Palestinian state would have to exist at least partly on the land that was previously designated to them prior to the 1967 war. And what has happened is Israel has effectively said, we're never giving it back. They don't say that. They just never give it back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there have been times where they have even explicitly said that under later administrations. Hold on, I'm letting somebody up real quick. Okay, sorry. I think that so some of the issue comes around, again, I think that the timelines on like what everybody is saying about these particular lands, I think is really important. So again, for Resolution 242, I don't think that it ever explicitly calls for, like, it doesn't call for the creation of like a Palestinian state or even ensures a Palestinian state. The language just says, I think a rightful or a just resolution, I should know the exact words, to the refugee problem is essentially what the Palestinians get relegated to, is like the refugee problem. I don't think there's any explicit guarantees to, I don't even think even self-determination is initially brought up in that. I think that later on, I think in the late 60s or early 70s, I think the PLO and Israel through their negotiations will start to re-recognize 242 as saying like, okay, well maybe this can include some right to self-recognition, to self-determination. But I think what 242 has meant has kind of changed as time has gone on. And I think there's been a lot of ambiguity historically what it means. So for instance, another thing too is people will say like, oh, 242 came out, everybody agreed that people have a right to their territory, et cetera, et cetera. Right after Resolution 242, there was the...
242 says withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict.
Yes. So that's the important part though, right?
It also says termination of all claims of or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force.
Correct. But when Eshkol, when the Prime Minister of Israel, when they were fighting over the wordage for 242, that was very particular. It wasn't withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from all territories occupied. It just says from territories occupied in the recent conflict. When they would later negotiate peace with Sadat after Yom Kippur, Israel's contention was, well, we've actually satisfied our obligations under 242 because we gave some territories back that were occupied in the recent conflict. That's what I mean when I say that I feel like the definitions of 242 and what those territories meant, because it doesn't say all territories.
I mean, that's very interesting, but again, that's sort of like the interpretation of international law that we were differing on when we were talking about what's going on in Gaza right now. Is like the reasonable interpretation, I think, and the general global interpretation of UN Resolution 242 was that Israel would withdraw from territories occupied. It didn't mean some territories or just
nobody knew what it meant. That's why nothing particular was laid out, right? Because keep in mind, even the prior boundaries were only ones that weren't even recognized in 48. Because after 67, after the 6-Day War, there was literally the Khartoum Conference where every single Arab state said no recognition, no peace, and it was no recognition, no peace, and no trade. What were the 3 no's? No recognition, no peace, no land, maybe. But like the Arab states had explicitly made it clear in Cairo that they were not going to be negotiating with Israel or recognizing her on any such terms. Especially after that humiliating war, there was no way they were ever going to.
I disagree with that interpretation of the Khartoum resolution
of the 3 no's, where they said we're literally never going to recognize.
That's not what they said. So the 3 no's were no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations.
But no recognition is.
But so again, I'm going to pull up. I just want to pull up the text of it.
Yeah, sure.
So you can see because that's generally that is again an Israeli talking point, but that's not what the 3 no's meant. I mean, it's a very compelling sort of framing of the 3 no's.
What is what possible other interpretation? Yeah.
Well, I think they were very clear what they said. I mean, and when you look at what historians have said about it and other experts of it, they are very clear. It wasn't no peace. It was no formal peace treaty. It wasn't no negotiation. It was no direct negotiations, and it wasn't that there was no recognition. It was no de jure recognition.
Sure, I actually agree with you. I think that's
that's a very different representation of it than saying we don't want any peace, we don't want any recognition, we don't want any.
I agree with you. I super agree with you. I like you brought this up. It's very true. It wasn't that they wanted no peace whatsoever. I think part of the tragic history of Israel and the surrounding Arab states, I think, is both of these sides put themselves on trains that are inevitably headed to crash into each other, and they always do this by thriving in these ambiguous agreements and in these ambiguous statements with the hopes that they can leverage these down the line. So when you say no peace with Israel, it's not that they don't want any peace whatsoever. It's that if peace comes, it might not be official. It might be a rigid, cold peace where they have some sort of just a ceasefire with no economic negotiations, and it might be a peace that leaves open future negotiations for either more military conflict, more land, or whatever. I think especially at 67, keep in mind, 67 was, puny, historically weak and hook-nosed, evil Jewish people somehow had militarily beaten all of these Arab states in the third war at that point. They were not in a position where they would have ever acquiesced to Israel owning territory there in any official sense. So I agree. They don't mean no peace like, oh, we'll never be peaceful. They just meant like, whatever peace we have, it is always going to be conditional on your ability to cooperate with us in this region. And that leaves it always open for future conflict, which unfortunately, well, for the Arabs, unfortunately for...
I would take it a step further, though. I think it was less abstract than that. I think it was no formal peace treaty until we have the formation of a state, of a legitimate Arab state. It wasn't just this abstract like carrot and stick thing. It was we recognize your territorial integrity, right? But we're not going to say formal recognition until what? There's an until there's a formation of a state, etc. Give me 1 second. I just got
you're good. Yeah, go for it. I read like 3/4 of that Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, and that book does a really good job at tying up like all of the history of this stuff, and it gives me more depth into this conversation too. So that book by Shlomo Ben-Ami, which is a really good book. I think I'm like 80 pages left, but one of the tragedies of the history of Israel-Palestine is, I've said some things that have ended up being more true than I initially thought. Like, one of the things I've said is that both sides want to fight all the time, but one side is delusional. Both sides seem to have enjoyed continuing the conflict for a long time with the hopes that they could acquire something more. But unfortunately for the Arabs, it was Israel that continued to acquire more, just because Jews did politics so much better, politics and military operations so much better than the surrounding Arab states. Not because it wasn't a unified Muslim front. It wasn't even a unified Arab front. It was just because the Arab states were always also vying with each other for territorial claims. Also, I think something that I've said kind of before that I think is like a billion times more true than I realized is the Palestinians have truly gotten fucked in all of this, because they are literally just a pawn for the surrounding Arab states to fuck with Israel. I don't believe any surrounding Arab states genuinely give a fuck about Palestinian rights to having land or a state. I think they always just saw them as a convenient weapon that can be wielded against Israel when convenient to do so. Israel expansion, ? Israel retains the former mandate plus Golan. Wow, so much expansionism. Well, the expansion is taking the entire West Bank, the entire Sinai, and all of the Golan Heights. There's a lot of expansionism. Yeah, and I think Moshe Dayan even admitted in an interview into the north with Syria that like they would try to provoke fights because Israel knows that the Arabs were really eager to go to war if they had the opportunity to, and if Israel has like a first strike from the other side, that they can conquer more territory and will continue to do so. But unfortunately, I think the Arab states just always kind of played into it because of their lack of statesmanship or their lack of strategic understanding, until certain leaders emerged that were better at being leaders, with Sadat from Egypt, I think, being a really key figure. Hi.
Yes. I think, I think it's important because I think that framing, even of the Khartoum conference, is important because it often becomes a situation where Arabs are framed as these recalcitrant people who don't actually want a peace deal and who just say no matter what. When in fact, I think it's, as you pointed out, it's complicated, you know. These peace deals break down, these land deals break down for lots of reasons.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting, because I would say they didn't want peace because they wanted future conflict, because they didn't really want Israel there, which is fair for them to feel. But I think Israel didn't really want peace either. They were just willing to go along. Yeah, because they will take advantage of any military situation to situate themselves territorially even better. But again, I think the issue...
That could be an October 7th argument, though. That's my point.
Yeah, it can be, but the issue is that the surrounding Arab states have to stop walking into it over and over again. Like, for instance, even for the Six-Day War, I think Israeli people wanted the West Bank, but they were realistic. There were two different communications to, I think it was Abdullah at the time, please do not attack us. Why are you attacking us? And then he loses the entire West Bank because he gets wrapped up in the war against Israel. And then Israel conquers the entirety of the West Bank because he attacked. But if he wouldn't have, yeah, go ahead.
That's a different conversation. I do have to go in a second.
Yeah, you're fine.
The idea that even historians at this point even Israeli historians at this point acknowledge that was not a defensive war. Israel struck first. The argument now is not that Israel didn't strike first, it's that Israel needed to strike first and that it was a preemptive defensive war, which has been an argument that's been largely sort of dismissed in terms of rules of war and in terms of the international law. But Israel no longer claims that they were hit first. They claim
No, Israel absolutely was not hit first. No, they did, I think, for about a month after the Six-Day War began, and then finally they said, no, we attacked first. Was it a preemptive war? Yeah, absolutely, considering they attacked first. Was it a justified preemptive war? I think that the conversation gets a lot more hairy at that point. I think the scary part for Israel is they were alone in the world with no allies. This was, I think, Ben-Gurion's worst nightmare come to fruition, that Israel hadn't made strong allies in the West yet. The United States was unwilling to give guarantees for peace. They were surrounded by hostile Arab nations that now had the full support of the Soviet Union behind them. I do agree, now that I've read a lot more on this, I don't think even Egypt initially wanted to go to war. I think that all the Arab states, though, were playing this dangerous game of brinksmanship where they were all goading each other. If you remember, like the Samu incident, and then the King of Jordan telling Egypt, well, look at you, you dog, with your UN peacekeeping forces there. Syria was constantly goading attacks against Israel and Israel against Syria. And at some point, the situation built up to such that I think Israel could reasonably say, I feel like I'm about to get absolutely murked. All these people around me are about to kill me. I need to go to war first. I think it was fair for them to say that. I also think it's probably fair to say that they really didn't want to go to war, but man, they all hyped themselves up into it so much. It's hard to feel bad for them at the end of the day on it, I think.
I think if you begin from the place of saying that the entire formation of the Israeli state itself, take international law off the table for a minute, particularly since
it's hard to apply it anywhere here. But,
right. Yeah. Right. And if we begin at the end of the 19th century, it becomes even harder to sort of, international law it's meaningless, right? And again, I don't want to retrofit.
Sure.
So the entire move by the admission of the kind of leaders of the Zionist movement, the political Zionist movement, is itself a colonial move, and they were pretty honest about that. Right. I mean,
I would be more clear. The only reason I don't like calling it colonial is because colony usually implies like Britain is making a colony or France is making it, like in Algeria, for instance, which ironically is how the Palestinians saw their fights sometimes. It is like a something. But calling it settler colonialism or imperial colonialism is a little different. The Arabs saw them as like Europeans coming in and being expansionists from European countries.
They saw themselves that way. Herzl himself said we're colonialists.
They saw themselves as part of the expansion, or they saw themselves as Westerners, but they weren't like a colony of America or Britain. Like they genuinely wanted to be part of that land with no loyalties overseas. That was like, they saw that as like the place to set up their new country. I agree that it was something like foreign for the Arabs there, and I agree the Arabs there saw them as like essentially European settler colonialists, but it's a little bit different than like Britain is setting up a colony here, I think. I would just try to
it's a different type of, it's a different genre of, it's a different flavor of settler colonialism, because typically the colonizing power itself settles. I think that's true. But in this case, Britain is it is the British government that is allowing this colonial project to happen. It is through the British mandate system that we see the real kind of regimentation and codification through Balfour and other things of the colonial project that, again, the Zionists, and particularly the revisionist Zionists, but I would say Herzl as well, but even when you get to Jabotinsky and others, they explicitly use the language of colonizing. They say it. So again, we can disagree with it, but it's a very
it's like the child soldier argument. Right. I agree that it's like some kind of colonial thing. I would say it's a bit different. It's
a different type, yeah.
And it's also different. Like, it's also hard because of the way that it started prior to 48. Like buying land and kicking people off of it, I understand feels bad, but like I remember for King Abdullah from Jordan, like he literally was saying, I think it was in regards to the Peel Commission. No, it was to the Simpson Commission. I think the quote of his is the Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in useless wailing and weeping about it, because even though they were complaining, some Arabs were complaining about Israelis moving in, other Arabs were happy to sell the land. Hey, buy this, I don't want it anymore, this is garbage, I'm leaving, kick out whoever you want and then leave. And I think that's like another complicating factor where it's like,
but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, because the land system that the Palestinian population was used to was not one of modern capitalism.
Yeah.
And so if you're following the Mushah system and you're saying, look, it's kind of like it's not none of our land. We kind of share it, we use it.
Yeah.
It's a different system. So again, I don't want to retrofit a kind of modern model of saying, okay, well, they were just giving away their land, like Crazy Eddie giving away, going at a business sale. Sure. It wasn't like that. I think that wouldn't be accurate. But beyond that, the Palestinian disposition toward immigration was always one of welcoming. And it was always one of diversity. The issue was never that these people were coming in. It was the first waves. The first wave of Zionist immigration, in 1882,
1880s, yeah.
Yeah, that wave, which again wasn't as successful for a particular reason, was not nearly regarded in the same way as the kind of post World War I second Aliyah of 1914, right? 1914. Because now you have the Jewish National Fund, Now you have a kind of concerted effort to organize not just a wave of people coming in, but as you point out, co-opting of land, of employment resources, etc. And so it wasn't that people were just coming, is that they were coming, as you pointed out, and kicking other people off. But it wasn't just that they got outmaneuvered. It was, or that they were just these, it was that the British government or the British colony, effectively, was creating the conditions, what they called empire on the cheap, right? We're going to be an imperial power, but we're going to have this new yishuv, this new kind of pre-48 Israeli state, be the stewards of this place, right?
Yeah, but I think it's challenging because, like, arguably all of the other states kind of took shape in the same way, right? Like all of these places, Syria, Iraq, Jordan.
But who did they
Egypt.
expel? That's the question.
I mean, they might not necessarily expel anybody, but the country lines and everything were drawn by by the British, and then these countries existed at the behest of the British. Britain, unfortunately, overpromised land via the Balfour Declaration, and then after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, to Arab Palestinians and to incoming Jewish people. And I guess they realized, especially after the Peel Commission, that became unworkable. But I don't know if I can necessarily fault Jewish people up to that point for legally purchasing land and then moving down there under the auspice of British protection.
The issue isn't the purchasing of land, although the issue is but the project, the political Zionist project, wasn't one of just purchasing land and moving somewhere. It was the creation of a state that could only exist through the expulsion of other people. You can't have a Jewish state with a demographic majority of non-Jews. And so at the moment that they said this is going to be a Jewish state, and the project began of transfer. A Jewish state only exists with transfer. It's just a demographic reality. And so the issue isn't the acquisition of land, it's what does it mean to acquire land and kick other people off of it. And so by the time we get to 48, and by the way, all of these skirmishes, not all of them, but I would say most of these skirmishes, when you mention these reports, the Simpson report, the Peel Commission report, all these reports are basically saying the same thing. The issue here isn't religious conflict. The issue here isn't xenophobia. The issue here is that the Arabs are being dispossessed, and they're pissed about it. And so,
I agree. By some points, like, it had become unworkable, and both ends had essentially felt like they'd gotten by the British. From 36 to 39, the Arab revolts in Palestine were brutally crushed by the British, and then from 40 onwards, the Haganah and the Irgun were committing attacks against the British because the British had then started to severely limit Jewish immigration, and I think the Brits severely overpromised and kind of fucked this area up, given what they were trying to do with it, which to this day remains impossible, is getting two people with hugely contrary interests trying to share the region. I don't know 100%. I don't, like, for instance, for 48, for 50, for 48, 58, the Suez Crisis was 58 or 56. And then for 67, 36, and then for 67, I don't think I fault the Arab states for fighting those wars. Even for Yom Kippur afterwards, I don't think I fault them for fighting those wars, for feeling they had some kind of moral authority to expel the European Israelis from those territories. I think I can agree that they have a right to fight there. I think I can also be sympathetic towards Israel, not to invoke the Holocaust memes or everything, but, like, man, the conditions around the world basically made it perfect for Israel to set up the state too. They did get that Balfour Declaration in 1917 from Britain that promised them some piece of land there. They did try to play nice, although, to be fair, it was after.
No, they did.
Well, when they agreed,
disagree.
They did agree to the partition plan. They did agree to it.
Which, you mean the Peel Permission?
The one that came after, I think, where they tried to partition the land, where it would have been 55% Jews and 45% Arabs. Yeah, the UN agreed in 47. Yeah. But for reasonable reasons, I can understand why. I can understand why Palestinians wouldn't have liked that. But, like, there's also a history. There's a history of, like, Israel had no recognition from the surrounding Arab states in 48 for its borders. But after she won After she won in 67, all of a sudden everybody was like, well, hold on, maybe we do actually like these 47, 48 borders. And then after she continues to win wars, there's like more recognition after Israel has asserted itself basically in a militarily dominant fashion. And I think that's kind of how, and the Arabs did it too, right? Where people seem to only respect the strength of the other side. Israel gained territory through the acquisition of war, like the Six-Day War. Yeah. And Israel only got peace, and Egypt was only able to sue for peace after doing well in the first few days of the Yom Kippur War, right? It was only after the Arabs had, redeemed themselves in their eyes that they felt like, okay, well, you know what, we can fuck you guys up if we want to. Now let's do some land for peace. But even that talk with Sadat was a secret one, and even Egypt was expelled from the Arab League for 10 years afterwards for that bilateral peace agreement because the rest of the Arab states were so upset about it. It
seems like your position is undergirded by the belief that violence and war and these things are going to at least happen. Now, I'm not saying you approve of them, but that they're sort of inevitable parts of
I feel like the history of Israel-Palestine, and I think on a microcosm, unfortunately, we see it repeat with the Palestinians and the Israelis, is that both sides are willing to cycle through periods of violence because they think that it's going to benefit them, but historically it just has happened to benefit Israel. I think that's been the issue, and now we're seeing it repeat with after time, the Arab states are like, okay, well, the war sucks. We just want to trade now because this is like a waste of all of our time, and the U.S. gives us a lot of money if we make peace with you, in the case of Egypt and Jordan. Now the Palestinians, I think, are locked in this same cycle because they've been abandoned by everybody. All the bilateral treaties have fucked the Palestinians over. They don't have any allies now except for the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iran. And they're locked in that same cycle of violence. Well, we're going to keep fighting. I don't want a two-state solution where I have 80% of the West Bank and there's like an Israeli road and military base between every single fucking house we have. It's ridiculous. And then the Israelis are like, okay, well, I'm not going to make peace with you. I tried to do it 10 times in the past. You shot down every single one and you kept doing violence, whether it was the second Intifada or any of the Hamas attacks afterwards to get your peace. Both sides are like locked on these train tracks where it just feels like they just want to keep fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. And it just seems really hard to break them out. I'll ask you, because I know you've got to go. By the way, the next person you're talking to is my political arch nemesis, Hassan, which is very funny. Don't tell him you came from here. I'm just curious on your opinion. You can respond to what I just said, and then what do you think is like the most realistic path forward? Like, can Hamas be negotiated with? What is the leadership that the Palestinians should look for? What do you think is like the best way that we encourage both sides to move in a direction where we stop having, these fights all the time? Yeah.
I think it's a great question. I think nothing that we've done works. We have to start there, right?
Yeah.
I think that the two-state solution. Well, let me just back up one more thing. One thing I also say is, again, just in response to what you just said, is again the idea that both sides are doing these things frames this in a language of equivalency that I don't accept. As a beginning, there's a power dynamic here, and there's also a moral authority here that I think Israel does not have, which sort of takes us full circle to where we began.
Sure. I think I would agree to some extent. Israel acts like the Yishuv in 46, and like they still have an existential threat on all sides, and they probably need to not act like that anymore. So I can agree with you a bit there. Yeah.
Right, and for me, because the Yishuv is nurtured and formed before Hitler ever rises to power, I view the entire project as not beginning out of the kind of urgency of the Holocaust, but because it wasn't, but out of a legitimate desire to have one's own self-determined nation and land, because of the permanence of anti-Semitism, the perennial vulnerability that all Jews feel around the world because of Jew hate around the world. It's a legitimate thing, right? And so I understand the desire for a state. What I don't understand, even against the backdrop of pogroms in Ukraine and Poland, Russia, whatever, is creating a state on the backs of or at the expense of the Palestinian people. And so I think any solution has to begin not from a place of these are two people who are warring over land, but rather there's a group of people who have been dispossessed of their land by a group of people who themselves have their own legitimate concerns and legitimate needs. So if we begin from that place, that the Palestinian people have been dispossessed, then the question becomes, what does restoration look like? Netanyahu has said many times that we have to kind of respond to the facts on the ground, the realities that we're facing. I cannot imagine a situation realistically where Israel withdraws, where Israel gives land back. I don't see it. The West Bank is the longest military occupation in modern history. I don't see them suddenly tomorrow saying, you know what, here you go. And I've heard all the stories about, 2000 Clinton Accords, yada, yada. They were willing to do it. They were not, right? I mean, when we scratch underneath the surface, what we saw was Bantu Stan's divided land. What you just talked about, big, I don't know if you've been over there, but I've spent many much time over there. And, it's even the prescribed state post-Oslo is something wildly different than what anyone would want in real life. So in light of that, in light of the fact that I don't see Israel giving land back, and I don't see a legitimate two-state solution happening, nor do I see the desire or will for it. And Netanyahu has said as much, and now everyone again is using October 7th as a pretext to say, well, we really wanted that two-state solution, but yeah, you fucked it up now. Yeah, we can't do it now. In light of that, which I think could actually be a helpful confession, even if it's disingenuous in terms of its reasoning, I only can see a one-state solution as a viable outcome. Do I think that is a perfect solution? No. Do I think that's a morally just solution? No, because ultimately I've broken into your house and worn you down to the fact that you're willing to split it with me.
Can I ask just too quick on that? Because the more that I look at the maps, the more that I look at the territory and everything, a one-state solution would be so nice if it could work. But on the two issues is, what do you do about the Palestinian refugee problem? Because we don't have to get into what a Palestinian refugee is, but like there's 6 or 7 million of them now. If there is a one state, the Palestinians are going to want that right of return. And then what possible security guarantee do you give a Jewish citizen, an Israeli citizen, that one state isn't going to lead to, a third or fourth or fifth intifada or all sorts of domestic terrorism against their people? Like, why would they ever be compelled to accept that, I guess? And then you can take off after. I know I've kept you for a while.
No, it's a great question. I mean, yeah. I don't want to slip into your war is hard kind of posture, although but like there's a way that you have to say, like, people don't get to get other people's land or get backup countries simply because they feel unsafe, even if the unsafety is warranted. Right? So because the question presumes a certain kind of heightened duty that we have because of this fear. I think that I think there are two things we need to think very strongly about. We have to figure out how to create a solution that keeps Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, however you want to describe them. But I'm going to say Palestinians, I'm speaking about the nation right now.
Yeah, sure. That's fair.
But also I'm thinking about, I want to be clear because I don't want people to think I'm using Arab in the way that the Israeli state uses Arab to deny the Palestinians. I'm saying Palestinians and also the other surrounding Arab nations.
We're talking Israelis and Palestinians, so the people that would live in whatever greater state.
Inside of this one state, whether it's a single secular democratic state or whether it's a binational state, there's multiple ways this could look. But I think there's two things we have to think about. One is the kind of historical fear of Jews being persecuted in other countries and not having a place to go. And I think that I think that we could use our political imaginations a little more creatively and say, there's a difference between saying we have a state that anybody can come at all times and saying that we can have a state that is for Jews and Palestinians, but at the same time have a special status for people who are fleeing for particular reasons, right? We can have a policy of welcoming refuge. I mean, in theory, that's what the Refugee Act of 1950 whatever is supposed to do, but in theory, I'm saying I would be fine with a nation state if it were up to me, and it's not up to me. But if it were up to me, I'd be fine with any country saying, look, persecuted Jews around the world have a right to come here. Which addresses the outside issue. Your question, though, I understand, was about the internal fear. I would argue that the fear of intifadas are always acts of resistance. The idea that, again, going back to the Taft Commission, the Peel Commission, the Simpson Report, all this stuff, all the white papers from the British, all the historical moments, the resistance Palestinians offer is in response to their dispossession, not because of Jew hate. So if we begin from a place of saying people have justice, then there will be peace. And that might sound like a lefty cliche, but I think it's true. I think if Palestinians have a contiguous, healthy, democratic state, I don't think you see acts of violence. I don't think you see the kind of danger that you're talking about. If they have access to safety, dignity, self-determination, freedom, etc., I think you'll see exactly what you need to see.
Okay. All right. I could argue with you more on that, but listen, I super appreciate the conversation. If you're ever bored or ever want to chat again in the future for any of this, I super appreciate the talk. Is there do you have any books or anything you want to shout out, or social media or anything where people can find you, or YouTube?
Yeah, I've written 8 books, but and I have one book called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Thought. The Limits of Progressive Politics. That's probably Freudian. that people can check out. But the most important thing, since this is a stream, I want people to check out the YouTube channel. I'd love for people to subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out some videos I made, and kind of be part of my daily journey. Marc Lamont Hill official. If people could check that out, that would be dope, man. I'm new to this world, and there's like all of you amazing YouTubers and streamers and online, people who have these huge followings, and you're doing such important, interesting, cool conversations. And I'm like, oh shit, there's a whole world out here that I didn't know about that I want to be a part of. So I would just love if folk could jump into the conversation, follow me, and let me be part of that world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome, cool. And then I'm just curious, if you had to recommend like 1 or 2 books to read on this particular topic, what would you recommend people if they wanted to find out more information besides access cheating?
That's a great question. I like, for a quick kind of explainer and understanding of an overview, I like Rashid Khalidi's new book, the 100 Years War on Palestine. Mm-hmm. I also like, if you want a book that feels a little less, what's the word? I don't want to say neutral, because I think Rashid does a wonderful book, but I would say One Palestine Complete by Tom Segev is a great book. One Palestine Complete. It's a great sort of historical analysis by an Israeli historian, who I think gives a really interesting sort of examination of that initial period. Uh-huh. It doesn't go over the complete 100-year history, but you'll get a great understanding of that 30-year period under the British Mandate. I'm trying to think what else. But those would be 2 off the top of my head that I would say would just be really good to read.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yep. Well, hey, listen, I super appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Hopefully we can chat again in the future. And yeah, have a good one, man.
You too. Talk soon.
Bye.